I sat at my own 70th birthday dinner surrounded by family when my son slammed 15 legal documents onto the table. He and his wife smiled, announcing to everyone that my mind was gone, and they were seizing everything I owned, including my freedom. I did not yell. I just wiped my mouth and walked away. By the next morning, I sold the very ground his mansion sat on, and he lost absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned, not inherited. My name is Gregory. I am 70 years old, and for the last 4 decades, I poured my blood, sweat, and soul into building a commercial logistics empire from the ground up. I am an African-American man who learned early on that the world does not hand you anything freely. Everything I have I earned with calloused hands and sleepless nights. It was supposed to be a milestone celebration. The private dining room at the upscale downtown steakhouse was lavishly decorated. Extended family members chatted happily over expensive wine, and the warm glow of crystal chandeliers cast a golden light over the heavy mahogany table. The aroma of prime rib and roasted garlic filled the air. Dominic, my 38-year-old son, stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon to make a toast. Beside him stood his wife Megan, an image of calculated perfection in a designer dress with a smile that never quite reached her cold eyes. I looked up expecting a tribute, perhaps a few kind words about the father who had handed him a comfortable executive life and a pristine operating company to manage. Instead, Dominic signaled a waiter who handed him a thick leather binder. Dominic opened it with a terrifyingly calm demeanor and pulled out a heavy stack of papers. Exactly 15 documents. He slapped them down onto the center of the table right next to my birthday cake. The loud thud silenced the entire room instantly. Conversations died and the air grew thick with a sudden suffocating tension. Megan stepped forward. She placed a manicured hand on my shoulder. Her grip was surprisingly tight, digging into my collarbone like a vice. Her voice dripped with fake, sugary sorrow as she addressed my brothers, sisters, and cousins. Everyone she announced, projecting her words so even the waiters lingering in the shadows could hear clearly. We have some difficult family news to share tonight. Gregory has been struggling immensely lately. The doctors have officially confirmed early-stage dementia. Dominic and I are taking over his medical and financial decisions to protect him from himself. I stared at the 15 documents, the 15 hits. I could read the bold print at the top of the pages. Irrevocable asset transfers, total relinquishment of commercial properties, a blanket medical power of attorney. They had plotted this ambush perfectly, using a public family gathering to corner me. Megan leaned down her lips, brushing my ear, whispering, so only I could hear the venom beneath her sweet facade. Sign them, old man. You are moving into our basement tomorrow morning, and your house goes on the market by noon. Do not make a scene. The silence in the private dining room was deafening. My Aunt Clara sat with her mouth slightly open while my cousin Marcus stared firmly at his plate, refusing to make eye contact. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody spoke up. Nobody ever wants to intervene when a wealthy family airs its dirty laundry, and Dominic had banked heavily on that cowardice. He pushed a heavy gold pen across the pristine white tablecloth toward me. He looked at me with an expectation of absolute obedience. He genuinely believed that my age had made me weak and vulnerable. He thought that the threat of public humiliation in front of our entire family would force me into compliance. I looked at the gold pen resting against the stark white cloth. I looked at the 15 documents that represented the entirety of my life work and the legacy I had built from dirt. Then I looked at the son I had raised. I did not yell. I did not flip the table or curse at his wife. Anger is a loud, reckless emotion, and I had learned a long time ago in cutthroat boardrooms and freezing freight yards that true power operates in absolute silence. I slowly picked up my linen napkin. I dabbed the corners of my mouth carefully and folded the cloth neatly, placing it next to my untouched steak. I stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Dominic's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I pushed the chair in, turned my back on the entire room, and walked toward the hallway. Megan called out my name, her voice losing its sweet edge, turning sharp and demanding. I completely ignored her. I walked with steady, measured steps, leaving the gold pen and the unsigned papers behind me. I pushed open the heavy oak door of the men's restroom and locked it firmly behind me. The cold water from the brass faucet felt grounding on my face. I grabbed a paper towel and looked at myself in the large gold-framed mirror. I saw gray hair and deep lines etched around my eyes. They were maps of exhaustion, sacrifice, and survival. But my mind was as sharp as a diamond. Dementia. The sheer audacity of their lie almost made me laugh in the empty room. Staring into my own reflection, my thoughts drifted back 40 years. I was not born into money. I grew up wearing hand-me-downs, working grueling double shifts at the city docks. I remembered the exact day my late wife Sylvia handed me a battered paper envelope. It contained her meager savings from 3 years of scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. Her knuckles were raw, but her smile was full of hope. We used that money to buy a single rusted, faded blue delivery truck. We slept in the freezing cab of that truck during winter nights. We ate cold sandwiches on the dashboard because we could not afford diner food. I drove 18 hours a day, building a logistics fleet route by route, mile by mile. Sylvia passed away 10 years ago, but her fierce resilience lived on in my blood. I made a promise on her deathbed to protect our empire. We built an unshakable foundation from absolutely nothing. I was not about to let a spoiled, ungrateful boy and his greedy wife dismantle Sylvia's legacy with 15 sheets of forged paper. A loud, violent crash shattered my thoughts. The restroom door flew open, the lock snapping violently under the force of a heavy kick. Dominic stormed in, his face flushed red with unhinged rage. The polished executive facade was completely gone, replaced by the desperate, furious panic of a man losing control of his carefully laid plan. He marched right up to me, invading my personal space, breathing heavily. Before I could even say a word, he lunged forward and physically snatched the keys to my vintage pickup truck right out of my hand. The jagged metal scraped my palm, but I did not flinch. "You think you can just walk away from me," he spat, his voice echoing sharply off the tile walls. "I am done playing games with you. Give me the code to your home safe right now." I stood my ground, refusing to let him see an ounce of intimidation. "You do not dictate terms to me, Dominic." He stepped closer, waving a folded paper in my face with a trembling hand. "This is an emergency medical guardianship order signed by a real doctor." He threatened, his eyes wide and manic. "If you do not give me that code and walk back out there and sign those asset transfers, I will dial 911 right now. I will hand this paper to the police and tell them my dementia-riddled father is having a violent, psychotic break in a public restroom. They will drag you out of this restaurant in a straitjacket. You will lose your dignity, your freedom, and your money tonight. The choice is yours, old man." I looked at the veins bulging in my son's neck and the crazed desperation in his eyes. He was a man backed into a corner of his own making, and I knew he was entirely capable of executing his threat. If I caused a scene, the police would arrive and see a well-dressed young executive holding medical documents signed by a doctor alongside a seemingly erratic old man. I had to defuse the immediate physical threat to secure my escape. I kept my breathing slow and steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my heart race. 749218, I said, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. That is the 6-digit combination to the wall safe in my primary study. The master deeds are on the second shelf. Dominic's rigid posture instantly relaxed. A smug, triumphant grin spread across his face as he stepped back. He pocketed my heavy truck keys, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a sickening air of victory. He truly believed he had broken me. He pointed a finger at my chest, instructing me to walk back to the dining room, sit quietly, and eat my birthday cake while he went to collect what was his. I offered a slow, obedient nod. Dominic turned on his heel and marched out of the restroom, the door swinging shut behind him. I did not follow him. I waited exactly 5 seconds, counting the beats in my head. I turned away from the main exit and pushed open the heavy swinging door marked Staff Only. The transition was jarring. I stepped from the quiet luxury of the restroom into a chaotic, sweltering commercial kitchen. Chefs shouted orders over the roar of industrial ventilation hoods, and waiters rushed past with trays of sizzling steaks. A sous chef glared at me for a split second, but quickly looked away, assuming I was just a confused elderly patron who had taken a wrong turn. I kept my head down and walked with grim purpose past the dishwashing station and straight toward the heavy metal delivery door. I pushed the emergency release bar. The door clanged open, and the freezing torrential rain of the city night hit my face like a physical blow. I was without my truck and without my winter coat, but I was out of their immediate trap. Walking briskly down the dark service alley, the icy water immediately soaked right through my thin flannel shirt. I ignored the shivering in my shoulders and focused entirely on the architecture of my business empire. 5 years ago, Dominic had thrown a massive tantrum demanding control of the family business. He claimed I was holding him back from his true potential. I obliged him, but only partially. I handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer for the Public Operating Company. I gave him the corner office, the platinum corporate expense accounts, and the daily logistics management. He got the illusion of absolute power and the ego boost he so desperately craved. But I am not a fool, and I never have been. Decades ago, after a ruthless competitor attempted a hostile corporate takeover, I built an impenetrable legal fortress around my assets. I placed every single physical item of value under a completely separate, overarching holding company. The actual fleet of 400 commercial trucks, the massive suburban distribution warehouses, and the prime real estate were all locked away in this invisible vault. Dominic's operating company owned absolutely nothing. He was essentially just renting the equipment from his own father on a month-to-month basis. The 15 documents on that restaurant table meant absolutely nothing because Dominic did not even know the holding company existed. My late wife Sylvia's legacy was safe, and I was about to drop the guillotine on my son's fragile glass empire. I navigated through the torrential downpour, keeping to the shadows of the old industrial district. My heavy work boots splashed through deep puddles as I walked 4 blocks away from the restaurant. I needed to cut the financial cord immediately, before Dominic realized the safe code was entirely fake. I spotted an old battered payphone illuminated by a flickering street lamp outside a closed laundromat. I dug into my damp jeans pocket, retrieving a handful of quarters I always carried out of pure habit. I fed the coins into the cold metal slot and dialed a private unlisted number by memory. It rang twice before a sharp, gravelly voice answered. Oliver Thorne was not just a lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate bulldog, a man who treated litigation like blood sport, and he was my oldest friend. I did not bother with pleasantries. I explained the situation in tight, rapid sentences. I told him about the birthday ambush, the 15 forged documents, the fake medical guardianship order, and the physical theft of my truck keys. The casual warmth in Oliver's voice vanished instantly, replaced by a lethal professional coldness. I gave the execution orders without a single ounce of hesitation. Freeze every corporate credit account linked to Dominic and Megan immediately. Lock down the operating company's bridge loans. Call the commercial insurance brokers and cancel the liability policies on the entire trucking fleet, effective right now. Oliver agreed instantly, warning me that by morning, Dominic would be facing a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. I told him that was exactly the point. I hung up the heavy plastic receiver, feeling a deep, satisfying click. The financial bleed was officially stopped, and the counterattack had begun. I stepped out from under the broken plastic awning of the laundromat. The rain was still coming down in thick, blinding sheets, turning the city streets into slick black rivers. I turned my collar up against the biting wind and began the long walk toward the nearest subway station. My mind was already calculating my next destination, my secure suburban dispatch office. As I crossed an empty intersection, my peripheral vision caught something distinctly unnatural. It was the slow, heavy crawl of tires rolling over wet asphalt. I did not turn my head directly, but kept my pace steady, relying on the reflections in the dark storefront windows. A sleek black SUV with heavily tinted windows crept around the corner. It did not accelerate to pass me. Instead, it matched my walking speed perfectly, keeping a deliberate distance of exactly 30 yards. I turned left down a narrow commercial avenue. The SUV signaled and turned left-right behind me. I paused, pretending to tie the wet lace of my work boot. The vehicle immediately applied its brakes, idling silently in the rain. Megan had not just relied on a public restaurant ambush. She was far too calculating for that. She had hired private security to track my every move. They were hunting me, waiting for the perfect isolated moment to enforce that forged medical guardianship order and drag me away. I was on foot, unarmed, and being hunted in the very city I helped build. I did not panic. I knew this city better than the back of my hand. I had paved these streets, driven massive rigs down these exact avenues, and memorized every blind spot long before Megan ever set foot in my state. I maintained my steady pace, making a sharp right turn onto a wider street to give the driver a false sense of security. The black SUV sped up, slightly eager not to lose me in the torrential downpour. I kept my head down, shielding my face from the freezing rain until I reached the entrance of the old garment district. This area was a labyrinth of forgotten loading docks, narrow service alleys, and abandoned brick factories from the 1980s. I ducked into a slender passageway between two towering brick warehouses. The alley was too narrow for any standard vehicle to navigate. I heard the sudden screech of wet brakes as the SUV slammed to a halt at the mouth of the alley. A heavy car door slammed shut, but I was already gone. I moved quickly and silently through a maze of chain-link fences and rusted dumpsters vaulting over a low retaining wall with an agility that would have surprised my son. By the time the hired muscle reached the end of the alley, I was 3 blocks away, slipping into the quiet residential fringes of the suburbs. I walked for another 45 minutes, letting the freezing rain wash away the last traces of the birthday dinner. My destination was a small, unassuming, cinder block building sitting on an overgrown lot near the edge of the county line. It looked like an abandoned auto repair shop, but it was my secret dispatch office. This was the physical heart of my holding company, an off-the-books location that Dominic had absolutely no knowledge of. It was where I kept the master physical deeds, the vehicle titles, and the true financial ledgers. I approached the building from the rear tree line, feeling the familiar crunch of gravel under my wet boots. I reached into my pocket for the heavy iron key I always carried, but as I rounded the corner, my blood ran completely cold. The reinforced steel side door was standing wide open. The heavy deadbolt had been violently sheared off, lying uselessly in the wet gravel. Searing anger flashed through my chest. Dominic might not have known about this place, but Megan was a different breed of predator. She must have hired someone to track my daily routines for weeks, cataloging my movements and discovering this hidden sanctuary. I approached the open doorway with the silent, practiced steps of a man used to navigating dangerous freight yards in the dead of night. I did not barge in. I stood just outside the frame, peering into the dimly lit office space. The air smelled of burnt metal and ozone. Standing in the center of the room was a man I recognized immediately. It was Megan's younger brother, a heavily tattooed grifter who spent his life bouncing between failed schemes and petty crime. He was wearing heavy leather work gloves and protective goggles, pressing a massive industrial core drill against the thick steel plate of my concealed wall safe. Sparks showered the floor, illuminating his desperate, sweating face. He was grunting with exertion, completely absorbed in destroying the lock. They had sent him here while they kept me trapped at the restaurant. They wanted to steal the physical documents to ensure I could never prove the holding company existed. They wanted to strip me of absolutely every defense before throwing me into a locked medical ward. The audacity was staggering. A younger, more reckless version of myself would have charged into that room and handled the boy with my bare hands. But physical confrontation is a fool's game, especially when you hold all the right cards. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating into the freezing rain. The heavy steel door was designed to swing outward, and the original exterior latch brackets were still fully intact. I reached down into the wet gravel and picked up the heavy-duty commercial padlock that had been knocked aside. The shackle was untouched. He had only destroyed the deadbolt. I grabbed the cold metal handle of the door and pulled it shut with a swift, silent motion. Before the boy inside could even register the sudden plunge into darkness, I slid the heavy padlock through the exterior steel brackets and snapped it shut with a resounding metallic click. He was entirely trapped inside a windowless cinder-block fortress with no secondary exit. I heard a muffled shout of confusion, followed by the heavy thud of a drill dropping to the concrete floor. Fists began pounding against the thick steel door, but it was completely useless. I stepped back into the shadows of the tree line, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed 911. I spoke in a calm, steady voice, reporting a violent burglary in progress at my commercial property. I gave the exact address and explicitly stated that the intruder was currently locked inside and potentially armed with heavy industrial tools. The dispatcher assured me that multiple units were already on their way. I ended the call and waited in the freezing rain, listening to the frantic, panicked screaming coming from inside my office. Less than 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers pierced the dark suburban street. The cruisers swerved onto the gravel lot, heavily armed officers stepping out with flashlights illuminating the padlocked door. I emerged from the tree line, keeping my hands clearly visible, identifying myself as the property owner who placed the emergency call. Before I could even finish giving my statement to the lead officer, a sleek black luxury sedan sped into the lot, tearing through the puddles and skidding to a halt right next to the police cruisers. The doors flew open. Dominic and Megan rushed out, stepping into the rain. Megan was holding a thick manila folder, her face twisted into an expression of exaggerated, frantic concern. She ran straight toward the police officers, completely ignoring me. "Officer, please, thank God you are here," she cried out, her voice shaking with perfectly rehearsed panic. "My father-in-law is having a severe psychotic episode. He is suffering from advanced dementia and wandered away from his caregivers tonight." Dominic stepped forward aggressively, holding up the stack of papers. "We have an emergency medical guardianship order signed by a judge and a licensed psychiatrist. The man locked inside that building is not a burglar. He is a certified caretaker we hired to watch over this property, and my father just locked him in there in a fit of paranoid delusion." Dominic pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, looking the police officer right in the eye. "He does not know where he is. He is a danger to himself and others, and we need him restrained and transported to a psychiatric facility right now." The lead officer took the heavy manila folder from Megan. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers cast harsh, disorienting shadows across the wet gravel. The officer shined his tactical flashlight onto the official-looking paperwork, shielding it from the freezing rain. I stood perfectly still, letting the icy water soak my shoulders, maintaining a posture of absolute calm. The officer flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. I could see the thick gold seal of a notary public and the bold, unmistakable signature of a licensed psychiatric specialist at the bottom of the form. It looked entirely legitimate on the surface. Megan had spared absolutely no expense in fabricating this elaborate medical trap. She began to cry softly, burying her face into Dominic's shoulder. She played the role of the exhausted, terrified daughter-in-law flawlessly, her shoulders shaking with fake sobs. "Officer, please." Dominic pleaded, his voice cracking with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "He has been wandering the dark streets for hours, completely lost. He locked our hired employee inside that freezing building out of sheer paranoia. He is a severe danger to himself and the community. We need him transported to the secure psychiatric ward at Mercy General immediately before he hurts someone." The officer looked from the dense legal documents to me, his expression caught between professional duty and human empathy. He approached me cautiously, resting a hand near his utility belt, just in case I lashed out. "Sir," he asked, his tone gentle but firmly authoritative, Do you know what day it is and what you are doing out here? I knew exactly what was happening. If I raised my voice, if I argued aggressively, if I tried to tell the officer that the man locked inside my dispatch office was a common thief attempting to drill into a wall safe, I would sound exactly like the delusional, paranoid old man Dominic described. The trap was sprung flawlessly. Dominic was aggressively demanding a police escort to force me into a medical vehicle. He wanted me dragged away in handcuffs, kicking and screaming at the top of my lungs to permanently validate the forged diagnosis. I looked at the smug satisfaction creeping into the corners of Dominic's mouth. He thought he had me boxed in with no possible exit. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill my lungs. I did not raise my voice or step aggressively toward the armed officers. Instead, I offered the lead policeman a warm, reassuring smile, keeping my hands open and visible at my sides, completely submissive to their authority. "Officer," I said in a quiet, level tone, "I understand exactly what these documents suggest and why you must investigate. My son and his wife are clearly very distressed tonight. I have absolutely no intention of causing a scene or making your difficult job any harder. If they truly feel a medical evaluation is necessary for my own safety, I will gladly comply and go with the paramedics." The officer's tense shoulders immediately relaxed. He had expected a volatile, dangerous confrontation with an unhinged dementia patient, but instead found a cooperative, rational senior citizen speaking with crystal-clear logic. I stepped away from the cinder-block building and walked deliberately toward the waiting ambulance that had just pulled into the gravel lot. Dominic's triumphant smile faltered, instantly twisting into a grimace of pure frustration. His entire strategy relied heavily on my aggressive resistance. He desperately needed the police to physically restrain me to document a violent outburst on an official police report. By completely surrendering without a fight, I robbed him of the very spectacle he engineered. Megan glared at me, her fake tears drying up in a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing with calculating malice. I climbed into the back of the ambulance unassisted, sitting calmly on the sterile vinyl bench. A paramedic wrapped a thick thermal blanket around my freezing shoulders. I looked out the back doors of the ambulance, catching Dominic's eye one last time before the paramedic closed them tight. I was entering the lion's den completely voluntarily, but I was doing it entirely on my own terms. The ambulance ride was incredibly quiet, the rhythmic thrum of the heavy tires rolling over wet asphalt serving as a steady metronome. I stared at the blank white walls of the medical transport, letting my mind drift back to a crisp Sunday morning almost 30 years ago. Dominic was just 10 years old, standing in front of the hallway mirror in his oversized Sunday suit. He was holding a striped silk tie completely tangled in his small hands, getting frustrated and close to tears because he wanted to look sharp for church. I had knelt beside him, guiding his tiny fingers through the intricate loops of a Windsor knot, showing him how patience always yields a much better result than force. He had looked at me with such pure, unadulterated admiration back then. He believed his father was invincible, and I truly believed he would grow into an honorable man who would carry our family legacy with profound dignity. Now sitting in the back of an emergency vehicle, orchestrated by his own treacherous greed, I realized that innocent boy was completely gone. He had been slowly suffocated by extreme entitlement and unearned luxury, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger who viewed his own father as nothing more than a stubborn obstacle blocking a massive corporate payday. The immense grief of that realization was heavy, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight, but I absolutely refused to let it break me. I had to mentally bury the ghost of my beloved son in order to survive the ruthless monster he had actively chosen to become. The ambulance backed into the concealed loading bay of the Mercy General Psychiatric Ward. I was escorted by silent orderlies through a maze of sterile, brightly lit corridors and locked into a stark, windowless observation room. The heavy security door clicked shut, leaving me in total isolation. I sat on the edge of the rigid hospital bed, waiting patiently. 30 minutes later, the heavy magnetic lock disengaged. A tall man in a pristine white lab coat stepped into the room. He did not introduce himself or bother to check my vital signs. He closed the door behind him and locked it deliberately from the inside. I recognized his face instantly from the glossy letterhead on the forged documents Dominic had presented to the police earlier. This was the corrupt night shift doctor entirely on Megan's payroll. He held a small silver medical tray in his gloved hands. Resting on the cold steel surface was a large syringe filled with a thick amber liquid and a digital video recording device. He approached me with a chilling clinical detachment, his eyes devoid of any standard medical empathy. "It is time for your medication, Gregory," he stated flatly, his thumb resting heavily on the plunger of the massive sedative. The plan was terrifyingly obvious and brutally efficient. He was going to inject me with a heavy dose of unauthorized narcotics, wait for my motor skills and speech to collapse, and then film me drooling and completely incoherent. That fabricated video would be submitted to a federal judge at dawn, serving as irrefutable visual proof of my advanced mental decay. He stepped closer, raising the sharp needle catching the harsh fluorescent light of the room. I remained perfectly still, letting him grossly underestimate my awareness. I looked at the sharp needle gleaming under the harsh hospital lights. I knew that if that liquid entered my bloodstream, I would lose total control of my faculties and hand them the exact video evidence they needed. I raised my hand, with a slight intentional tremble, playing the part of a terrified, confused old man. "Doctor, please," I begged, letting my voice crack perfectly. "I am terrified of needles. My late wife used to give me pills when I was agitated. Please do not stick me with that." The doctor paused, his eyes narrowing with irritation. He looked at the heavy syringe and then at the digital camera resting on the tray. He needed me compliant, but he also did not want to leave physical bruises or puncture marks that a real medical examiner could question later. He sighed heavily, placing the syringe back down on the cold steel tray with a metallic clatter. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small plastic cup containing a large blue capsule. "Fine," he muttered, pushing the cup toward my face. "Take this. It will accomplish the exact same thing, but it works slower. Open your mouth and swallow it right now." I took the plastic cup with shaking fingers. I placed the large blue capsule into my mouth and took a sip of the stale tap water he offered. I tilted my head back, simulating a deep swallow, but I expertly pushed the thick pill deep into the pocket of my cheek, right under my tongue. I opened my mouth to show him it was empty. He nodded with cold satisfaction and turned his back to set up his recording equipment. The moment he looked away, I silently spat the dissolving capsule into the dark fabric of my flannel shirt sleeve. I lay back against the rigid hospital mattress, letting my eyelids flutter and droop. Within 3 minutes, I slowed my breathing to a shallow, rhythmic crawl, letting my limbs go completely limp. I was putting on the performance of a lifetime, completely faking a chemically induced coma. The doctor walked over, lifted my wrist, and let it drop heavily onto the mattress. I did not react. He smirked, turned on his camera, and filmed my incapacitated state for exactly 2 minutes before shutting off the lights and leaving the room, locking the heavy door behind him. The moment the heavy magnetic lock clicked shut, I opened my eyes in the pitch-black room. My mind was racing, but my movements were slow and deliberate. I slipped my hand down to my left ankle and reached inside my heavy work boot. Before leaving the restaurant, I had secured my secondary cell phone deep inside my thick wool sock. I pulled the device out, navigating the screen entirely by touch in the dark to avoid casting any visible light. I opened the voice memo application, pressed record, and slid the phone under the small gap at the bottom of the heavy security door. The hallway outside was dead quiet, allowing the sensitive microphone to pick up the approaching footsteps perfectly. I pressed my ear against the cold metal doorframe. The corrupt doctor was returning, but he was not alone. The sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels announced Megan's arrival. Her voice hissed through the narrow gap, vibrating with intense, greedy urgency. "Do you have the video?" she demanded. The doctor scoffed, answering with arrogant confidence. I have 5 minutes of high-definition footage showing him completely unresponsive and severely cognitively impaired. It is more than enough for the judge tomorrow morning. Now where is the rest of my payment? Megan's tone turned vicious and calculating. You will get the remaining $50,000 in cash as soon as the permanent guardianship is officially stamped. Dominic is preparing the commercial loan documents right now. Once that old fool is legally declared a vegetable, we are taking his signature stamp and leveraging his entire commercial logistics fleet. I have a private broker lining up a $2 million cash advance against the trucks. The sheer audacity of her scheme made my blood boil in the darkness. She was not just trying to steal my bank accounts. She was actively plotting to mortgage my entire empire for quick, untraceable cash. The doctor chuckled a dark, greedy sound. $2 million is a massive payout. What happens when the banks come looking for their collateral next month? Megan laughed a cold, heartless sound that echoed off the sterile hospital walls. Let them come, she sneered. By the time the bank realizes the company is bleeding dry, Dominic and I will be out of the state with the cash untraceable. They can foreclose on the trucks and take the empty houses for all I care. The old man will rot in this ward and the creditors can fight over his scraps. I slowly pulled my phone back through the gap and saved the audio file. I had just captured a crystal-clear confession of federal bank fraud conspiracy to commit medical malpractice and elder exploitation. The trap they built for me had just become their own prison. I retreated to the rigid hospital bed and sat in the dark, waiting with the absolute patience of a predator. I knew Oliver Thorne was already moving. When I called him from the payphone in the freezing rain, I had given him explicit instructions for this exact scenario. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 3 a.m, the chaotic silence of the psychiatric ward was shattered by the violent banging of heavy double doors being forced open. I heard loud, aggressive voices echoing down the hallway, followed by the frantic, panicked protests of the night shift nursing staff. A heavy fist pounded on my door before the magnetic lock disengaged with a loud electronic buzz. The door swung open, flooding the dark room with blinding hallway light. Standing in the doorway was Oliver Thorne, looking like an absolute force of nature. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase, and flanked by 2 massive armed private security contractors. Right beside him stood the corrupt night shift doctor. His face completely drained of color, sweating profusely and trembling like a leaf. Oliver did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. He shoved a heavy stack of legal documents directly into the doctor's chest. That is an emergency writ of habeas corpus signed 20 minutes ago by a federal district judge. Oliver roared, his voice echoing down the entire ward. It explicitly details severe civil rights violations, unlawful medical detainment, and kidnapping. You will discharge my client this exact second, or my associates will physically remove him while I call the Federal Bureau of Investigation to have you arrested for holding a perfectly healthy man hostage. The doctor stared at the federal seal on the documents, his arrogant demeanor entirely eradicated. He fumbled with his clipboard, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his pen. He stamped the discharge papers without uttering a single word of protest. I stood up from the bed, smoothing the wrinkles out of my damp flannel shirt. I walked past the trembling doctor, looking him dead in the eyes with a cold, knowing smile. I walked out of the sterile room and strode down the hospital corridor side by side with Oliver. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency exit parted, and I stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and quiet. I was completely free. Dominic and Megan believed they had successfully caged me and stolen my empire. They were currently sleeping in their mansion, dreaming of their $2 million payday. They had absolutely no idea that I was already out walking the streets with a loaded gun of legal evidence, and their total financial annihilation was scheduled for sunrise. I sat in the sprawling leather chair of Oliver Thorne's corner office on the 42nd floor. The sun was just beginning to break over the city skyline, casting a sharp golden glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I held a steaming mug of black coffee in my hands, feeling the comforting heat seep into my bones. The frantic desperation of the hospital ward felt a lifetime away. Here in this silent, immaculate room, I was back in my element. I was the architect of my own empire, and it was time to systematically dismantle the boy who thought he could steal it. Oliver sat across his massive oak desk, tapping a silver pen against a thick stack of printed financial ledgers. He looked up, his eyes sharp and alert. We had spent the last 3 hours legally fortifying the holding company. I had handed him the audio recording from the hospital where Megan confessed her entire criminal scheme. He had already dispatched a trusted courier to deliver the digital drive directly to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But the complicated legal maneuvering was going to take time, and I wanted Dominic to feel the immediate devastating consequences of his betrayal right now. I leaned forward, placing my coffee mug on the polished wood. I looked Oliver dead in the eye and gave the execution order. "It is time," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Cut the main artery." Oliver nodded with a grim, satisfied smile. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the direct line to the commercial insurance brokerage that handled my entire logistics fleet. He bypassed the automated system and demanded to speak directly to the senior underwriter. The conversation was brief and ruthlessly efficient. Oliver identified himself as the chief legal counsel for the holding company, executing an immediate, irrevocable cancellation of the comprehensive liability and freight insurance for all 40 active commercial vehicles operating under Dominic's shell company. The underwriter panicked, warning that active trucks on the road would be immediately non-compliant with federal transport laws. Oliver simply replied that was exactly the intention. He hung up the phone and typed a rapid sequence of commands into his secure laptop, accessing the overriding GPS management portal for the fleet. Every single truck in my empire was outfitted with a remote engine immobilizer, a security measure I installed a decade ago to prevent cargo theft. I watched the global map on Oliver's monitor, tracking dozens of green dots moving steadily along the interstates. I gave a single nod. Oliver hit the enter key. Across town in the sleek, modern headquarters of the operating company, Dominic was putting on a masterclass in unearned arrogance. He stood at the head of the polished glass conference table dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, holding court with his senior logistics managers and dispatchers. He was radiating smug victory, boasting loudly about the aggressive new expansion plans and the massive upcoming commercial loans he was preparing to sign. He paraded around the room, acting as if the 40 trucks currently hauling millions of dollars in freight across state lines were the direct result of his own strategic genius. He believed the fake medical documents were currently working their magic, keeping me heavily sedated and permanently locked away. He thought his throne was absolutely unassailable. He commanded the dispatch team to pull up the live tracking interface on the massive digital wall monitors, wanting to showcase the sheer scale of the empire he believed he now owned. The dispatch supervisor clicked a button, illuminating the giant screen with a map of 3 different state highways. For a few seconds, the green dots representing the active fleet moved smoothly along the digital arteries. Then, without a single warning, the entire system violently glitched. The calm green dots instantly flashed a blaring warning red. The main dispatch console erupted in a cacophony of shrill electronic alarms. The supervisor hammered his keyboard in a sudden panic, his face draining of color. Dominic slammed his hands on the glass table, demanding to know what was happening. "Every single vehicle just threw a critical engine failure code," the supervisor shouted, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. "The immobilizers have been remotely triggered." Dominic scoffed angrily, telling the team to reboot the software and stop making excuses for technical incompetence. But this was not a software glitch. It was a digital guillotine. Out on the busy interstates, stretching from the northern borders to the southern freight hubs, 40 massive commercial rigs simultaneously lost engine power. Fuel lines clamped shut. Transmissions locked into neutral. The heavily loaded trucks became dead weight, forcing the drivers to wrestle the massive vehicles to the side shoulders of the bustling highways. The digital map in Dominic's conference room showed 40 distinct red icons completely paralyzed across the grid. The silence in his corporate office was shattered by the simultaneous ringing of a dozen emergency dispatch phones. The illusion of his absolute control was instantly vaporized. Dominic stared at the flashing red screen, the smug arrogance completely wiped from his face, replaced by the first creeping sensation of genuine terror. He barked at his managers to answer the lines, completely unaware that his nightmare was only just beginning. The dispatchers scrambled to answer the blaring phones. On the other end of the lines, 40 veteran truck drivers were screaming in sheer panic over the roar of highway traffic. They were stranded on the perilous shoulders of major interstates with heavy freight and absolutely no engine power. But the mechanical failure was only the beginning of the nightmare. State highway patrol units had already been electronically flagged by the Automatic Federal Transport Database. Within minutes, flashing police cruisers pulled up behind the stalled 18-wheelers across 3 different state lines. The drivers frantically yelled through the phones to the dispatch team, reporting that armed state troopers were approaching their cabs, demanding their commercial manifests and insurance documents. Dominic grabbed a phone from a trembling dispatcher, barking orders to his drivers to show the police the digital insurance cards on their tablets. He was sweating now, pacing the conference room like a trapped animal. The dispatch room speakerphone crackled to life, broadcasting the voice of a terrified senior driver confronting a state trooper. Dominic listened as the heavy thud of reality finally struck. The trooper's voice came through the speaker, loud and unforgiving. He informed the driver that the commercial liability insurance for the entire operating fleet had been explicitly, permanently canceled less than 10 minutes ago by the primary holding company. The trooper declared the massive vehicle an uninsured illegal hazard on a federal highway. Dominic froze his expensive suit, suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. He heard the terrifying metallic jingle of tow chains through the speakerphone. The highway patrol was not just issuing citations. They were actively seizing the entire fleet. 40 commercial trucks hauling millions of dollars of time-sensitive cargo were being impounded by the state police. Dominic stood in the center of his command center, surrounded by panicked employees, looking at the flashing red ruin of his stolen empire. He realized the horrifying truth. The old man was not locked in a padded room. The old man was awake, aware, and actively dismantling his life. Do you ever wonder what it feels like to watch everything you thought you stole vanish into thin air? Dominic slammed the heavy glass door of his executive office, violently shutting out the frantic cries of his dispatchers. The massive digital map on his wall was a glowing red monument to his sudden failure. He gripped his desk phone with sweating palms and dialed the direct line to his senior corporate banker. The phone rang 3 agonizing times before a crisp, professional voice answered. Dominic did not wait for formal greetings. He barked orders demanding an immediate emergency wire transfer of $200,000 to a secondary commercial insurance broker. He screamed that he needed temporary liability policies bound and active within the hour to get his seized trucks released from state impound lots before the daily fines bankrupted him. The banker on the other end remained perfectly silent, letting Dominic's frantic shouting echo through the receiver. When the banker finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of warmth or familiarity. I cannot authorize that transfer, Dominic. Your operating accounts are entirely frozen. Dominic slammed his fist against his mahogany desk, rattling his expensive coffee mug and spilling dark liquid across his pristine blotter. He screamed that he was the chief executive officer of a massive logistics empire and demanded the bank open a short-term bridge loan using the commercial truck fleet as direct collateral. He threatened to pull all his corporate accounts to ruin the banker's career and to file a massive lawsuit for obstruction. The banker did not flinch. He delivered the fatal blow with cold, calculated precision. You do not have an empire, Dominic. You do not own a single truck. You have absolutely zero equity to borrow against. Dominic's breath caught in his throat. He loosened his silk tie with trembling fingers, feeling the room spinning wildly around him. He yelled that he had the titles that his company was producing tens of millions in gross revenue. The banker calmly read back the harsh financial reality. The operating company's entire line of credit was exclusively guaranteed by the primary holding company. 10 minutes ago, the holding company officially revoked all financial backing and issued a cease and desist on all credit extensions. Your operating accounts are currently overdrawn by $500,000 in pending payroll and active fuel expenses. You are holding a massive empty bag. The bank is calling in your outstanding debts effective immediately. The line went dead. Dominic dropped the phone, staring blankly at his pale reflection in the dark computer monitor. Miles away in the quiet sanctuary of the 42nd floor, I sat across from Oliver Thorne. Oliver slid a thick manila folder across the polished oak desk. I opened it and looked at the brittle, yellowed incorporation papers dated over 30 years ago. My signature sat right next to my late wife Sylvia's elegant handwriting. Touching that old paper brought back a flood of memories from the late 1980s. Back then, our logistics fleet was just beginning to dominate the regional freight routes. Our rapid success attracted the attention of a ruthless corporate conglomerate. They tried to crush us with a hostile takeover. They bought off our primary fuel vendors, undercut our shipping rates, and attempted to buy our debt from local banks to force a sudden bankruptcy. Sylvia and I sat at our small kitchen table under a flickering light bulb and devised a phantom fortress. Sylvia was always the visionary, and she insisted we build an impenetrable defense. We spent every dollar we had on elite legal counsel to create the holding company. We systematically transferred every single physical asset we owned into this invisible vault. Every heavy-duty truck, every lug nut, every acre of commercial real estate, and every dispatch warehouse became the exclusive, irrevocable property of the holding company. We structured the public operating company to be nothing more than a management shell, a facade that simply leased the equipment from the holding company. If anyone ever tried to sue us or seize our business, they would hit a reinforced brick wall. They would be suing a ghost with zero tangible assets. That ironclad legal wall saved our livelihood decades ago. Now it was the exact same wall that was suffocating my treacherous son. Inside his sprawling corner office, Dominic tore through his filing cabinets like a madman. He threw expensive leather binders onto the floor, frantically searching for the master corporate contracts. He finally yanked out the 15 legal documents he had proudly slammed onto my birthday dinner table just hours prior. The very documents he believed granted him absolute supreme control over my life and my wealth. He spread the heavy pages across his glass desk and read the fine print with wide, terrified eyes. The legal jargon he had blindly paid cheap lawyers to draft was glaringly flawed. The transfer documents explicitly named the operating company. He had tried to force me to sign over control of a hollow shell. He owned 100% of an absolute ghost. He dug deeper into the older file boxes, finding the original operational lease agreements he had signed years ago without reading. The terrifying reality washed over him like a bucket of ice water. The operating company he controlled was contractually obligated to pay a massive monthly lease to my holding company for the trucks, the warehouses, and the very office building he was currently standing in. He did not own the leather chair he sat in. He did not own the desk. He realized the medical power of attorney was utterly useless. Even if he successfully committed me to an asylum, the holding company trust required a unanimous board consensus between myself and Oliver Thorne to execute any structural financial changes. Dominic was trapped in a financial nightmare of his own making. He was millions of dollars in debt, holding the bag for massive operational costs, driver payrolls, and active fuel contracts with absolutely zero assets to liquidate. He was personally liable for the catastrophic shortfall. The walls of his glass office felt like a crushing hydraulic press. His entire identity, his wealth, his arrogance had been entirely predicated on an illusion I allowed him to believe. He was not a king. He was just a glorified middle manager who had severely overplayed his hand. Suddenly, his cell phone buzzed violently on the glass desk. The caller ID flashed Megan's name. He answered it, expecting his wife to offer a lifeline or a cunning solution to the immediate disaster. Instead, Megan's voice came through sharp and frantic, completely disregarding his panic. She told him she was currently meeting with a high-end real estate broker in their living room. She instructed Dominic to quickly gather his valuable belongings because she was officially listing their million-dollar mansion for a rapid cash sale by the end of the week. She wanted to liquidate the house, take the cash, and flee the state before the commercial creditors came knocking at their door. Dominic stared out his high-rise window, feeling the last thread of his sanity snap. The blood drained entirely from his face. He gripped the edge of his desk as a new wave of absolute terror crashed over him. He realized with absolute horror that their sprawling suburban mansion was tangled in the exact same legal trap. He might hold the mortgage, but he did not own the dirt beneath it. Megan disconnected the call without waiting for Dominic to formulate a response. She tossed her phone onto the plush velvet sofa of her sprawling living room, utterly disgusted. For weeks, she had meticulously orchestrated my physical and mental demise, relying entirely on Dominic to execute the final administrative blow. Now he was stammering on the phone about frozen accounts and seized trucks, sounding like a panicked child. Megan was a predator who never tied herself to a sinking ship. She recognized the scent of absolute ruin, and she immediately initiated her own independent extraction protocol. She walked over to the massive marble kitchen island, where a man in a sharp but overly flashy suit was aggressively tapping a luxury pen against a leather folio. This was Richard, an off-market real estate broker known in the city elite circles for facilitating rapid, discreet cash transactions. He did not ask questions about marital disputes or corporate bankruptcies, as long as his exorbitant commission was guaranteed up front. Megan poured herself a glass of expensive, sparkling water, her mind working with cold precision. She told Richard she needed the mansion liquidated within 48 hours. She did not care about getting full market value. A property appraised at $2.5 million could be sold for $1.8 in pure, untraceable cash to an overseas holding corporation, and she would gladly take the haircut to ensure absolute speed. Richard smiled a predatory grin, completely eager to exploit a desperate seller. He assured her he had a buyer willing to wire funds blindly by tomorrow afternoon, provided the title was clear. Megan assured him her husband was on the deed, and he would sign whatever she put in front of him out of sheer desperation. She fully intended to forge the secondary signatures if Dominic hesitated. She mentally packed her bags, calculating exactly how many hours it would take to secure the wire transfer, drain their joint accounts, and board a first-class flight to a non-extradition territory. She viewed Dominic not as a husband, but as a temporary shield. She would leave him to face the federal fraud investigations, the enraged commercial creditors, and my impending wrath entirely alone. She walked Richard to the grand mahogany front doors, pointing out the custom Italian marble floors and the imported crystal chandeliers as if inventorying items for a liquidation sale. She explicitly instructed Richard not to list the property on any public databases. A whisper listing, she called it, ensuring nosy neighbors or aggressive debt collectors would not catch wind of her sudden departure. Richard guaranteed absolute silence. He promised to return by dusk with the binding cash offer documents requiring only her husband's desperate signature. Megan closed the heavy doors, feeling a rush of adrenaline. She poured a second glass of water, savoring the taste of her own ruthless survival instincts. She had completely abandoned the sinking vessel of her marriage without a single ounce of remorse. Back on the 42nd floor, Oliver Thorne's private desk phone chimed with a distinct, sharp tone. He picked it up, listening intently for less than 30 seconds before ending the call with a dark, satisfied chuckle. He turned his computer monitor toward me, displaying a secure, encrypted messaging application used exclusively by top-tier wealth managers and elite property brokers. Oliver possessed a vast, deeply entrenched network of informants, spanning every major financial and legal institution in the state. Absolutely nothing of high value moved in this city without crossing his radar. He pointed to a newly populated text thread. It was a digital whisper listing for a sprawling luxury estate located in the exact gated community where Dominic and Megan lived. The asking price was severely undervalued, demanding a rapid cash closing within 48 hours. Oliver leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands together. "Your daughter-in-law is a remarkably fast learner," he said, his voice laced with professional amusement. "She realized Dominic is completely financially paralyzed, and she is currently attempting to sell the mansion out from under him. She wants to liquidate the primary residence, take the cash, and vanish before the corporate fallout destroys her entirely." I stared at the digital listing, feeling a cold wave of familiar disgust. Megan had always been a parasite, feeding on the wealth I generated while looking down her nose at the calloused hands that built it. I remembered the day Dominic closed on that house. He was so incredibly proud of the massive columns and the iron gates. He bragged to his country club friends about his immense purchasing power. He never mentioned to any of them that the bank required a massive guarantor to secure the mortgage. He never told them that I personally structured the entire land acquisition to protect the family asset from this exact type of predatory behavior. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "She thinks she is running an end run around both of us," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "She believes she holds the ultimate trump card." Oliver smiled, reaching for his phone. "Shall I have my associates issue a formal cease and desist to her broker?" he asked. I shook my head, placing the mug down on the polished wood. "No," I replied. "A formal letter is too impersonal. She needs to understand exactly who controls her reality. I will handle this broker myself." I asked Oliver for the broker's direct contact information. He handed me a business card provided by his informant. Richard Vance, a man notorious for cutting corners. I dialed the number on Oliver's desk phone, bypassing all caller identification. Richard answered on the second ring, his voice slick and hurried, clearly high on the adrenaline of a massive incoming commission. I did not introduce myself with pleasantries. I spoke with the heavy, unyielding authority of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. "Richard," I said, my tone sharp enough to cut glass, "I am the legal guarantor and primary lien holder of the estate you just attempted to quietly list. You have exactly 1 minute to listen to me before I report your license to the State Real Estate Commission for actively facilitating severe property fraud." Richard stuttered, dropping his slick salesman facade instantly. He aggressively defended himself, claiming the wife assured him the title was clear and her husband was the sole owner. I cut him off completely. "Dominic is the registered owner of the physical bricks and the Italian marble," I explained coldly. "However, he does not own a single inch of the dirt beneath it. I hold the irrevocable deed to the land, and the ground lease explicitly forbids any transfer of the physical structure without my direct notarized authorization. The house cannot be legally sold to a cash buyer, an overseas corporation, or anyone else. It is financially chained to the dirt, and I own the dirt." Richard went completely silent on the other end of the line. The realization of his massive error crashed down on him. If he proceeded with the transaction, he would be directly implicated in a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud scheme. He began frantically apologizing, swearing he would shred the listing documents and completely block Megan's number immediately. I hung up the phone without another word. Megan's desperate escape hatch was permanently welded shut. She was now trapped in a crumbling mansion, with a ruined husband and millions of dollars in rapidly accelerating corporate debt. But trapping her was not enough. I needed to turn the two predators against each other. I looked at Oliver and gave him the next instruction. "It is time to let Dominic know exactly what his loving wife was doing behind his back." Oliver nodded slowly, a sharp glint of predatory amusement lighting up his eyes. He understood the strategy instantly. There is nothing more destructive than a fragile alliance built entirely on greed, especially when the walls start closing in. Oliver swiveled his monitor back around and quickly pulled a high-resolution PDF of Megan's whisper listing. He tasked his executive assistant to print it on premium-heavy stock paper, slip it into a blank, unbranded manila envelope, and dispatch it via a private same-day courier. The delivery instructions were explicit. Hand it directly to the receptionist at the operating company headquarters. and insist it must be placed directly onto Dominic's personal desk, marked extremely urgent. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the intense heat warm my chest. Dominic was already drowning in commercial debt, dealing with 40 seized trucks and frozen bank accounts. Finding out his loving wife was actively trying to sell the roof over his head for untraceable cash would be the final catastrophic blow to his shattered ego. I wanted him to feel the exact same betrayal he had inflicted on me, but amplified tenfold, because this betrayal was coming from the person sleeping next to him. The heavy manila envelope arrived at Dominic's glass-walled office exactly 2 hours later. He was currently pacing furiously behind his desk, screaming into his cell phone at a local towing company refusing to pay the exorbitant impound fees for the seized trucks. He slammed the phone down into its cradle, ending the call violently when he noticed the unmarked package resting squarely in the center of his pristine leather blotter. He tore the thick paper open, his hands still shaking with adrenaline from the endless string of corporate disasters. He pulled out the glossy printout. At first, he did not comprehend what he was looking at. He saw high-definition photos of his own custom Italian marble foyer, his expensive crystal chandeliers, and the sprawling manicured lawn of his gated estate. Then his eyes drifted to the bold red text at the top of the page. Off-market rapid cash sale. 48-hour closing required. Price negotiable for immediate liquidation. Contact Richard Vance directly. He dropped the heavy paper onto his desk, staring at it in complete disbelief. He read the contact name again, recognizing it as the shady broker Megan often gossiped about at their elite country club dinners. The blood rushed to his face, turning his skin a mottled, furious red. He realized instantly that his wife was not out running errands. She was actively liquidating his primary asset behind his back, preparing to take the cash and leave him holding the bag for millions in corporate liability. Dominic did not bother grabbing his suit jacket. He stormed out of his corporate headquarters, completely ignoring the frantic questions from his dispatch managers. He threw his luxury sedan into gear, tearing out of the corporate parking structure and breaking several speed limits as he raced toward his gated suburban community. When he burst through the heavy double oak doors of his mansion, he found Megan standing in the center of the grand foyer, directing 2 hired movers who were carefully packing a collection of expensive modern art into thick padded crates. The visual confirmation of her immediate departure shattered his last remaining shred of composure. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Dominic roared, his voice echoing violently off the vaulted ceilings, causing the hired movers to freeze in place. He marched right up to her, slamming the crumpled, glossy printout of the real estate listing onto a glass console table. "You are selling my house behind my back to a black market broker." Megan did not flinch. The sweet, loving facade she presented to the world vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating predator she truly was. She dismissed the movers with a sharp flick of her wrist, ordering them to take their break outside. Once the heavy doors clicked shut, she turned to face her furious husband, crossing her arms over her chest. "It is not your house, Dominic," she snapped, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "The bank owns 90% of it, and thanks to your absolute incompetence, the commercial creditors are going to take the rest by Friday. I am simply salvaging what little equity remains before you completely sink us both." Dominic's face contorted with unhinged rage. "You treacherous snake," he spat, stepping closer into her personal space. "We are supposed to be a team. We planned the medical guardianship together. We were supposed to leverage the logistics fleet together." Megan laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the empty marble foyer. "A team," she scoffed. "You cannot even manage a simple corporate lease agreement. You walked into that birthday dinner acting like a king, and you did not even realize your father had completely stripped you of every single asset. You own absolutely nothing, Dominic. You are a glorified middle manager drowning in millions of dollars of debt. I refuse to let your pathetic failure destroy my life. I am selling the house, taking my share, and leaving." The illusion of their unified front shattered violently, scattering like broken glass across the pristine floor. They stood in the grand entryway screaming vicious accusations at each other, tearing open old wounds and exposing the absolute rot at the core of their marriage. Dominic accused her of being a gold-digging parasite who only married him for the luxury lifestyle. Megan countered by calling him a weak, pathetic coward who spent his entire life desperately trying to step out of his father's massive shadow and failing miserably at every turn. They realized in that explosive moment that neither of them held the upper hand. They were both trapped in my rapidly shrinking cage. Megan turned on her heel, marching toward the grand, sweeping staircase. She informed Dominic with icy precision that her bags were already packed. She was moving into a luxury suite downtown immediately. She stopped on the first landing, looking down at her husband with absolute, undisguised disgust. "You have exactly until the end of this week, Dominic. Either you find a way to secure cash or force the old man to sign over the actual holding company assets, or I am leaving you. I will file for immediate divorce, and I will gladly testify against you in federal court regarding the forged medical documents if it guarantees my own immunity. Secure the cash, or you will face the corporate debt and the federal fraud charges entirely alone." She did not wait for his response, ascending the stairs and leaving him standing completely isolated in the echoing ruin of his stolen life. Dominic stood frozen in the grand foyer of his crumbling mansion, listening to the sharp clicking of Megan's heels as she ascended the sweeping staircase. She had given him an impossible ultimatum: secure a massive influx of cash by the end of the week, or face total abandonment and federal fraud charges entirely alone. The silence in the massive house felt suffocating. His operating company was dead. The commercial banks had completely locked him out, and his own father had legally fortified the very ground beneath his feet. He was drowning in a torrential wave of corporate debt, with absolutely no assets to liquidate. Panic gripped his chest, tightening his airways. He needed untraceable liquidity, and he needed it immediately. His desperate mind raced through a vanishing list of allies before landing on a singular dangerous idea: the corrupt night shift psychiatrist. Megan had paid the doctor a massive upfront bribe to falsify my medical records and secure the emergency guardianship order. The man was running a highly lucrative underground business catering to wealthy families looking to quietly dispose of their elderly relatives. Doctors operating in those shadowy circles always kept massive reserves of physical cash on hand. Dominic realized he held the ultimate leverage. The doctor was explicitly tied to a fraudulent medical diagnosis that could destroy his entire career and land him in state prison. Dominic sprinted out of the mansion and threw himself into the driver's seat of his luxury sedan. He gripped the leather steering wheel with white knuckles, his breathing shallow and rapid. He threw the vehicle into gear, tearing out of the gated community and speeding recklessly toward the private psychiatric clinic across town. He rehearsed his extortion pitch over and over in his head. He would march directly into the doctor's private office and demand $250,000 in unmarked cash by sunrise. If the doctor refused or hesitated, Dominic would threaten to walk straight into the district attorney's office and hand over the forged medical paperwork. He would expose the entire illicit operation to the state medical board, burning the doctor's career to ash. Dominic ran 3 red lights, swerving violently through heavy city traffic, driven entirely by raw, unhinged desperation. He believed he was executing a masterful stroke of predatory blackmail, completely unaware that he was driving blindly into a trap I had already sprung. Dominic pulled his sleek sedan into the quiet, tree-lined parking lot of the exclusive private psychiatric clinic. The building was a pristine, modern structure designed to project an image of absolute discretion and high-end medical care. He slammed the car into park, killed the engine, and grabbed his leather briefcase. He took a deep, jagged breath, preparing to kick down the doors and unleash his desperate extortion demand. He reached for the silver door handle, but before his fingers could even pull the latch, the tranquil silence of the parking lot was violently shattered. A fleet of 6 matte black unmarked tactical vans and 3 heavily armored police cruisers screeched into the narrow driveway, completely blocking the main exits. The vehicles swerved onto the manicured lawns, tearing up the expensive landscaping as they formed a tight barricade around the clinic entrance. Dominic froze in his leather seat, his blood running instantly cold. He sank down low, hiding behind the tinted windows of his sedan, watching in absolute paralyzed horror. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles. They wore dark olive tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There was no polite knock at the reception desk. There was no negotiation. The lead agents raised a heavy steel battering ram and violently breached the pristine glass double doors, shattering them into thousands of jagged pieces. The federal strike team swarmed the lobby, shouting aggressive tactical commands that echoed across the parking lot. Dominic could not breathe. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he watched the meticulously coordinated raid unfold right in front of his eyes. Within minutes, a steady stream of federal agents began marching out of the shattered entrance, carrying towering stacks of heavy cardboard evidence boxes. The boxes were explicitly marked with bright red seizure tags. Agents hauled out computer hard drives, thick filing cabinets, and stacks of patient medical records. Then, the devastating final blow materialized. The corrupt night shift doctor was forcefully marched out of the building. His pristine white lab coat was crumpled and torn. His hands were securely fastened behind his back, with heavy steel handcuffs. His face was entirely drained of color, an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror masking his previously arrogant features. He looked like a man who knew his entire life was definitively over. Two federal agents shoved him aggressively into the back of an armored transport vehicle, slamming the heavy metal doors shut with a resounding thud. Dominic watched the vehicle rock slightly from the force. The extortion plan evaporated instantly from his mind, replaced by a crushing, suffocating wave of genuine terror. He realized the agents were not just seizing the doctor. They were seizing the clinic's entire digital and physical database. Miles away in the quiet safety of Oliver Thorne's office, I received the secure text message confirming the raid was a total success. When Oliver's courier delivered the digital drive containing my hidden audio recording to the federal field office earlier that morning, the authorities did not hesitate. The audio file captured Megan and the doctor explicitly detailing a multi-million-dollar commercial bank fraud scheme, intertwined with elder exploitation and medical malpractice. It was a flawless smoking gun. The federal magistrate signed the search warrants with unprecedented speed, treating the clinic as the epicenter of a massive organized criminal enterprise. Sitting in his idling sedan, Dominic watched the federal agents continue to strip the clinic of its records. A horrifying realization washed over him, paralyzing his motor skills. The doctor was not going to quietly accept federal prison time. Men who operated in comfortable luxury always flipped at the first sign of real consequence. The doctor would immediately offer the FBI full cooperation, cutting a plea deal by handing over his wealthiest and most desperate clients. More terrifyingly, Dominic remembered the paperwork. The forged emergency medical guardianship order bearing his own signature, and Megan's signature, was sitting inside one of those confiscated evidence boxes. The federal government now possessed physical documented proof linking Dominic directly to the fraudulent diagnosis. He was no longer just a failing executive facing angry commercial creditors and a collapsing marriage. He was now an active primary co-conspirator in a severe federal investigation. He was tied to a doctor who was currently sitting in the back of an FBI transport van, singing like a canary to save his own skin. Dominic carefully reached up with a trembling hand and shifted his vehicle into reverse. He moved with agonizing slowness, terrified that the sudden rev of his engine might draw the attention of the armed agents securing the perimeter. He crept the luxury sedan backward, inch by agonizing inch, until he cleared the tree line and merged onto the busy main avenue. He drove away from the clinic with his heart pounding frantically against his ribcage, his hands slipping on the sweat-soaked steering wheel. He was no longer a predator looking to extort a weak target. He was a hunted man, surrounded on all sides by closing walls with absolutely nowhere left to run. Dominic drove erratically back to the gated community, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The terrifying image of the federal tactical team kicking down the clinic doors and hauling the corrupt doctor away in heavy steel handcuffs burned brightly in his mind. He swerved through the suburban streets, ignoring stop signs and speed limits driven purely by a suffocating sense of impending doom. He pulled into his expansive driveway, tires screeching against the pavement, and slammed the transmission into park. He sprinted through the front doors, finding the mansion eerily quiet. He discovered Megan in the master bedroom surrounded by her open designer suitcases. Her previous icy confidence was entirely gone, replaced by a stark, hollow panic. She sat on the edge of the plush mattress, staring blankly at the dark screen of her cell phone. The black market real estate broker had officially blocked her number, and her secret cash buyer had completely vanished after my phone call. She was just as trapped as he was. Dominic stepped into the room, his breathing shallow and ragged. He did not yell or throw accusations. The time for screaming matches and bitter resentment had officially expired. He looked at his wife and laid out the terrifying new reality. He described the tactical federal raid at the psychiatric clinic, the seized evidence boxes, and the doctor being shoved into a transport vehicle. Megan dropped her phone, her face draining of all color. The federal government now held the forged medical guardianship papers bearing both of their signatures. They were no longer just facing angry commercial creditors and a bankrupt logistics company. They were staring down the barrel of federal wire fraud, elder exploitation, and serious conspiracy charges. Prison was no longer a vague threat, but a rapidly approaching certainty. Survival instinct is a powerful unifying force. The vicious hatred they harbored for one another dissolved instantly, replaced by the cold, primal necessity of mutual preservation. Megan stood up and walked slowly toward Dominic. She did not apologize for attempting to sell the house behind his back, and he did not apologize for his massive corporate failures. They simply looked at each other and forged a desperate tactical alliance. They hugged tightly, playing the roles of a devoted couple united against a cruel world. The reconciliation was completely hollow, a fake truce built entirely on sheer panic and mutual liability. They needed to extract a massive amount of untraceable cash and flee the jurisdiction immediately. If they stayed in the city until Monday, the federal agents would inevitably come knocking on their custom oak doors. They needed a brilliant, aggressive extraction strategy. Megan wiped her face and immediately shifted into her predatory planning mode. She understood the psychology of their wealthy country club friends better than anyone. The local elite were driven entirely by status, exclusivity, and the desperate need to appear culturally sophisticated. Megan proposed hosting a grand high society art auction right in the main foyer of their mansion. They would market it as a highly exclusive private liquidation of their personal collection. In reality, Megan planned to procure dozens of high-quality counterfeit paintings and sculptures from a known underground art dealer she had met during her brief stint in high-end interior design. The wealthy guests would drink expensive champagne, eat premium catered hors d'oeuvres, and happily write massive personal checks for completely worthless canvases. It was the perfect vehicle for rapid, aggressive money laundering. Dominic paced the bedroom, nodding along with the brilliant scheme. They would deposit the personal checks directly into a pristine offshore account Megan had opened years ago under a dummy corporation. Once the funds cleared, they would board a private charter jet, waiting on the tarmac at the local executive airport, and disappear into a non-extradition territory before the wealthy buyers even realized they had purchased elaborate fakes. It was a bold, flawless exit strategy. They spent the next 2 hours frantically making phone calls. Megan contacted the underground art supplier demanding immediate delivery of the counterfeit pieces, ensuring they came with forged certificates of authenticity to fool their arrogant friends. She called a premium catering company, booking a lavish spread to maintain the absolute illusion of their immense wealth. Dominic contacted a private aviation broker, securing a long-range Gulfstream jet for a midnight departure on Saturday. The plan was moving forward with terrifying speed, but there was one massive, glaring obstacle: The underground art dealer, the luxury catering company, and the private aviation broker all demanded exorbitant upfront retainers. They explicitly refused to operate on credit for clients they knew were experiencing corporate turmoil. Dominic and Megan needed hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid cash right now, just to set the stage for their grand escape. Dominic returned to his home office, locking the heavy double doors firmly behind him. He opened his secure laptop and stared at the glowing screen with sinking dread. His operating company accounts were completely frozen, and his personal credit lines were entirely maxed out. He had absolutely zero legitimate avenues to secure the upfront capital required for the fake auction and the private flight. Desperation drove him to make the most reckless and fatal decision of his entire life. He accessed a highly secure commercial banking portal meant exclusively for elite corporate lending. He navigated to the emergency bridge loan section, selecting a massive short-term corporate debt application. The system required absolute verification and a physical signature from the primary guarantor. Dominic reached into his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a stack of old archived contracts bearing my authentic signature. He placed a blank piece of transparent tracing paper over my name and grabbed a heavy black ink pen. He meticulously practiced copying the strokes of my handwriting. He spent an entire hour perfecting the distinct loops and sharp angles of my signature until his hand physically cramped and he could reproduce it flawlessly on the fresh loan documents. He scanned the forged authorization and uploaded it directly into the commercial bank portal. He was fraudulently pledging the entire remaining value of the operating company and illegally leveraging the holding company name to secure a $500,000 cash injection. He clicked the submit button, watching the loading bar spin on the screen. He knew this constituted massive federal bank fraud, adding a decade to his potential prison sentence, but he truly believed he would be thousands of miles away before the bank ever flagged the transaction. He printed the approved loan confirmation, feeling a rush of toxic adrenaline. He believed he had successfully outsmarted the system and secured their golden ticket to freedom. He had absolutely no idea that the moment he clicked submit, the bank automated fraud detection software triggered a silent, immediate alert, sending a digital copy of the forged signature directly to Oliver Thorne. Oliver Thorne's secure mobile phone vibrated violently against his desk, disrupting the quiet hum of his corner office. It was an automated high-priority alert from the commercial banking portal linked directly to the holding company. He picked up the device, his eyes narrowing as he read the encrypted notification. A $500,000 emergency bridge loan had just been submitted, leveraging the operating company's non-existent equity and bearing my digital signature as the primary guarantor. The bank's internal fraud detection algorithm, a system Oliver had personally fortified with strict biometric and two-factor authentication protocols months ago, had instantly flagged the transaction. The loan attempt was frozen in a holding queue pending manual verification. Oliver smiled, a cold, predatory expression. Dominic had taken the bait, diving headfirst into an inescapable federal trap. Oliver called me immediately, explaining the monumental scale of Dominic's error. My son had not just attempted to steal. He had engaged in multi-jurisdictional wire fraud, forging my name on a corporate banking document transmitted across federal lines. This was the definitive, irrefutable strike. I told Oliver to arrange the meeting immediately. I wanted the final nails hammered into Dominic's coffin before the sun went down. Less than an hour later, I found myself sitting in the sterile, aggressively lit conference room of the local FBI field office. The walls were lined with heavy metal filing cabinets and corkboards covered in surveillance photos. Two senior agent specialists in white-collar crime and corporate fraud sat across the metal table. They had already been briefed by Oliver regarding the forged medical documents and the extortion attempt at the psychiatric clinic. This new development, however, escalated the entire investigation into an immediate high-priority federal case. Oliver placed a printed copy of the loan application on the table. The agents examined it closely, their expressions serious and professional. They needed absolute sworn confirmation that the signature on the document was fraudulent. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my reading glasses. I leaned over the document, tracing the lines of the signature with my eyes. Dominic had spent hours perfecting the forgery. The loops were right. The slant was accurate. But a signature is not just ink on paper. It is a reflection of the hand that writes it. My signature, forged by years of heavy labor and countless logistics contracts, carried a specific, undeniable pressure, a weight that Dominic's desperate, trembling hand could never replicate. I looked up at the agents, my expression resolute. This signature is a complete forgery. I stated clearly, my voice unwavering in the silent room. I have not authorized, reviewed, or signed any commercial loan documents regarding the operating company, nor have I granted anyone else the legal authority to do so on my behalf. The lead agent nodded, sliding a thick stack of official affidavits across the table. These documents were the sworn statements required to formally initiate the wire fraud charges. I took the heavy black pen offered to me and signed my name on the bottom line of each page. My hand did not shake. I felt no hesitation, no lingering trace of paternal guilt. I was signing away the last remaining shred of Dominic's freedom, effectively authorizing the federal government to dismantle his life. The agents gathered the paperwork, thanking me for my cooperation. The trap was fully armed, the legal mechanisms engaging with cold, inevitable precision. As I walked out of the FBI field office, the crisp afternoon air hitting my face, I thought about the forged signature resting on that metal table. I remembered a conversation I had with Sylvia decades ago, sitting on the porch of our first tiny home. We had just secured a massive contract, and a competitor had offered us a substantial bribe to walk away. Sylvia had looked at the thick envelope of cash with absolute disgust. She told me that money acquired through deception is cursed, that it rots the foundation of anything it touches. She believed that wealth must be built on honor, or it will inevitably destroy the builder. Dominic had violated every principle Sylvia held sacred. He had built his entire identity on an illusion, using my wealth to inflate his ego, and then attempted to steal the very empire that sustained him. He believed that his expensive suits and grand mansion insulated him from consequence. The mansion. That sprawling, multi-million-dollar monument to his unearned arrogance and Megan's insatiable greed. The thought of that house built on land I owned, hosting a fraudulent art auction designed to launder stolen money, ignited a new, profound sense of righteous fury within me. Stopping Dominic's escape was no longer enough. Sending him to federal prison was no longer enough. I needed to eradicate the physical symbol of his entitlement. I needed to wipe his grand illusion completely off the map. I pulled out my phone and dialed Oliver's number. Oliver answered immediately, the satisfaction of the FBI meeting still evident in his voice. I did not waste time. "Oliver," I said, my tone as hard as granite. "Contact the commercial developers who have been bidding on the suburban tracts. Tell them I am ready to sell the land beneath Dominic's house. But tell them they must agree to my specific timeline for demolition. I am going to tear that mansion to the ground." Oliver terminated this call, his face setting into lines of absolute unyielding determination. We had the green light. The final phase of the operation was officially underway. I remained seated in the quiet conference room, the scent of the FBI field office, a mixture of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner, lingering in the air. The federal agents had secured the forged documents, solidifying the wire fraud charges against Dominic. But the legal machinery, while inevitable, moved with a bureaucratic slowness I found deeply unsatisfying. I needed a visceral, immediate conclusion. I needed Dominic to witness the physical collapse of his stolen kingdom. We drove back to Oliver's high-rise office in silence. The city outside my window was a blur of steel and glass, a testament to the kind of hard, unrelenting work Sylvia and I had poured into our empire. Dominic had never understood that work. He only understood the rewards, the shiny veneer of success, without the underlying substance. His mansion was the ultimate symbol of that hollow entitlement. It was time to remove it from the map. Oliver had already assembled the necessary documentation by the time we returned. He placed a thick, leather-bound folder on his desk. This was not a standard real estate transaction. This was a strategic corporate maneuver. The land beneath Dominic's sprawling estate was prime suburban real estate, a massive parcel that I had secured decades ago under the holding company's name. It was zoned for residential use, but Oliver's network had confirmed that the surrounding area was rapidly developing into a high-density commercial zone. Oliver introduced me to the CEO of a massive commercial retail development firm via a secure video conference. The developer, a sharp, aggressively efficient man named Sterling, was eager to acquire the property. He outlined his vision, a sprawling, high-end shopping center that would anchor the new commercial district. The financial terms were staggering, far exceeding the assessed value of the land itself. Sterling recognized the strategic importance of the parcel and was willing to pay a premium to secure it. I listened to his pitch, my expression carefully neutral. I was not interested in the money. The holding company's assets were already vast. I was interested in the execution. I agreed to the financial terms, but I inserted a non-negotiable stipulation. The sale was contingent upon the immediate, unconditional transfer of the property, effective within 48 hours. Sterling hesitated, leaning closer to his webcam, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mr. Gregory," he said, his tone cautious, "while we are prepared to move aggressively, an immediate transfer presents significant logistical challenges. The land currently contains a massive residential structure. Our timeline requires the site to be completely cleared before we can break ground on the commercial center. We need a clean slate. We cannot afford delays associated with residential eviction or property disputes." I looked at Oliver, who offered a brief knowing nod. I turned my attention back to Sterling. "The physical structure currently occupying the land," I explained, my voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "is entirely irrelevant to this transaction. The individual residing in that structure does not hold the deed to the land. The property is legally owned by my holding company, and the ground lease explicitly grants me the unilateral right to authorize the immediate demolition of any structure built upon it, provided I assume full liability for the clearing process." Sterling's hesitation vanished, replaced by a ruthless, opportunistic gleam in his eye. He was a developer. He understood the value of a clean, unencumbered site. "If you can guarantee the immediate removal of the structure," he said, "we can execute the sale today. But we require absolute certainty. We cannot have demolition crews delayed by legal injunctions or residential protests. We need the land leveled." I pulled the thick contract toward me, uncapping my heavy black pen. "I am prepared to sign a comprehensive waiver," I stated, "granting your firm immediate, unconditional demolition rights to the property, effective upon the closing of this sale. Furthermore, I will personally coordinate and fund the demolition process. I will ensure that the site is entirely cleared down to the foundation before your construction crews even arrive." Sterling agreed. The legal teams exchanged the digital documents, the signatures were verified, and the multi-million-dollar transaction was finalized in less than an hour. The land beneath Dominic's mansion no longer belonged to the holding company. It belonged to a ruthless commercial developer who demanded a clean slate. Oliver immediately contacted a premier heavy-duty demolition contractor. He did not negotiate the price. He simply demanded absolute priority and precise timing. He instructed the contractor to deploy 3 massive industrial-grade bulldozers, fully fueled and ready for operation. The demolition was not to be a gradual dismantling. It was to be a rapid, catastrophic leveling of the entire structure. I reviewed the final contract, tracing the lines of my signature. It was authentic, firm, and entirely legal. It was the antithesis of Dominic's desperate forgery. I had not just stopped his fraudulent art auction. I had scheduled the absolute destruction of his world. Oliver looked up from his phone, confirming the demolition schedule. "The contractor is secured," he said, his voice low and serious. "They require a specific operational window. When do you want the structure leveled?" I leaned back in my chair, picturing the grand foyer of Dominic's mansion. I pictured Megan draped in designer clothing, attempting to launder stolen money through fake art, while her husband drowned in federal fraud charges. I wanted the destruction to be not just physical, but symbolic. I wanted it to occur at the exact moment they believed they had finally won. Schedule the demolition. I instructed Oliver for exactly 8 p.m. this Saturday. Saturday at 8 p.m. The absolute peak hour of Megan's high society art auction. The moment when the mansion would be filled with the city's elite, when the champagne would be flowing, and when Dominic and Megan would be finalizing their desperate, fraudulent escape plan. The bulldozers would not arrive in the quiet hours of the morning. They would arrive at the climax of their grand illusion. The destruction of their stolen empire would be public, immediate, and utterly irreversible. I pulled my battered pickup truck onto the perfectly paved shoulder of the private suburban road, just outside the towering wrought iron gates of Dominic's estate. It was 10 minutes to 8. From my vantage point, sitting in the dark cab of my truck, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the grand illusion unfolding inside the brightly lit mansion. The sprawling circular driveway was packed heel to toe with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts sprinted back and forth, collecting the keys of local politicians, technology investors, and wealthy country club socialites. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows, I watched the high society art auction operating in full swing. A hired string quartet played a lively, elegant Vivaldi composition, providing a highly sophisticated soundtrack to a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. Waiters in tailored black vests glided smoothly through the dense crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of premium imported champagne. Megan was standing proudly in the center of the grand foyer, playing the role of the flawless, devastated hostess parting with her beloved private collection. She wore a custom emerald green designer dress that easily cost $10,000. The heavy silk fabric shimmered under the warm light of the imported chandeliers, matching the cold, calculated ambition in her eyes. She smiled warmly, placing a manicured hand on the arm of a prominent city councilman, laughing at a joke before smoothly pivoting his attention toward a massive abstract canvas hanging on the wall. The walls of my son's house were completely covered in these vibrant paintings. They were elaborate, completely worthless forgeries provided by Megan's underground dealer, accompanied by pristine, entirely fabricated certificates of authenticity. She moved through the wealthy crowd with predatory grace, absolutely intoxicated by the illusion of her own superiority. She believed her expensive dress and her elite connections completely insulated her from consequence. She was oblivious to the massive crater of federal and corporate ruin she was standing directly on top of. The sheer audacity of hosting a criminal enterprise disguised as a high society gala on land that I legally owned ignited a cold, righteous fire in my chest. Across the spacious room, I spotted Dominic standing near a velvet-roped viewing area. He was wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue tuxedo, holding a crystal snifter of sparkling water. He was acting the part of the reluctant seller, graciously accepting condolences from wealthy friends, who believed the couple was simply downsizing their extensive portfolio for an upcoming European relocation. A prominent real estate mogul shook Dominic's hand and passed him a heavy embossed envelope. I knew exactly what was inside. It was a personal check for tens of thousands of dollars. Dominic slid the envelope into the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket, patting the fabric smoothly. Even from a distance across the dark lawn, I could see the sudden rush of toxic adrenaline flush his cheeks. He was collecting massive sums of untraceable, quickly clearing funds directly from his arrogant friends. He believed the grand escape plan had worked flawlessly. He touched his breast pocket again, feeling the stiff paper of $500,000 resting safely against his chest. The private charter jet was confirmed and waiting on the dark tarmac of the executive airport just an hour away. The offshore bank accounts were primed and ready to receive the laundered deposits. To Dominic, the terrifying federal raid on the psychiatric clinic and the catastrophic freezing of his commercial trucking fleet felt like a distant, fading nightmare. He was high on the fumes of his own deception. Every handshake was a victory lap. Every collected check was a middle finger to the empire he failed to steal from me. He caught Megan's eye across the crowded room, and they shared a brief conspiratorial nod. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the commercial banks, evaded the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and most importantly, utterly defeated me. He thought his reckless forged bridge loan had bought them the exact window of time they needed to vanish without a trace. The finish line was just hours away, and he felt absolutely invincible. I checked the heavy steel watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8 o'clock. The time for silent observation had officially expired. I stepped out of my truck, ignoring the young valet who rushed forward to intercept my rusted vehicle. I walked right past the long line of imported sports cars, my heavy steel toe work boots crunching loudly against the pristine gravel driveway. I bypassed the main security podium, entirely stepping directly up to the grand entryway. The heavy custom-built oak double doors of the mansion were closed tight, muting the classical music and the wealthy chatter inside. I did not knock. I did not ring the polished brass bell. I placed both hands flat against the solid wood and shoved the massive doors violently apart. They hit the interior walls with a resounding, thunderous crack that physically shook the grand foyer. A cold, biting gust of evening wind swept immediately into the heated, perfume-scented room. The sudden draft caught the massive crystal chandeliers, causing them to sway erratically and cast sharp, shifting shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. The hired string quartet, noticing the abrupt, violent commotion at the main entrance, faltered instantly. The lead cellist missed a sharp note, and within 3 seconds, the lively classical music ground to a complete awkward halt. The sudden, deafening silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The wealthy guests turned their heads in unison, parting like the Red Sea as their hushed murmurs of confusion rippled rapidly through the foyer. I stepped over the threshold and stood perfectly still in the center of the doorway. I was not wearing a tailored tuxedo or polished leather loafers. I wore my heavily faded red flannel shirt, grease-stained denim jeans, and heavily scuffed work boots. I was the physical embodiment of the hard, brutal labor they all looked down upon, yet I was the only true king in the room. I looked entirely alien among the silk dresses and diamond necklaces, yet I commanded the massive space with the absolute terrifying gravity of a man who owned every single atom of the ground beneath their feet. My eyes cut straight through the dense crowd of terrified socialites and locked dead onto Dominic, pinning my treacherous son firmly in place. Dominic's champagne flute shattered against the polished marble floor, the sharp sound echoing through the sudden silence. He stood frozen, staring at me as if I were a ghost that had crawled out of a nightmare to haunt him. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him pale and sweating under his expensive tuxedo. Megan, however, did not freeze. Her shock instantly transmuted into vicious, explosive rage. Her carefully constructed facade of the elegant, devastated hostess vaporized. She stomped forward, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking aggressively against the marble. "What are you doing here?" she screamed, her voice cracking with fury, completely abandoning any pretense of high society decorum. "Get out! You are trespassing!" She turned wildly toward the 2 massive, suited private security guards stationed near the main entrance. "Remove him," she ordered, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "He is a delusional, mentally ill old man who has wandered off his property, and throw him out into the street right now." The wealthy guests murmured in shock, pulling back to create a wide circle around the confrontation. They clutched their champagne flutes, horrified and fascinated by the sudden eruption of domestic warfare. A prominent local politician whispered something to his wife, his eyes wide with scandal. The security guards hesitated, exchanging an uncertain glance. I did not move. I did not flinch. I stood like a monolith in my scuffed boots, my presence a stark, immovable contrast to Megan's frantic hysteria. Before the guards could take a single step, the heavy oak doors swung open again. Oliver Thorne stepped into the foyer. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He wore his sharp, dark charcoal litigation suit, clutching a thick, heavy leather binder. He moved with the effortless, terrifying confidence of a man holding all the execution orders. "I strongly advise against touching my client," Oliver announced, his voice carrying the calm, lethal authority of a seasoned corporate litigator. "He is the sole legal owner of this estate, and you are all currently standing on his private property." Oliver did not wait for the security guards to process the information. He marched directly toward Dominic and Megan, stopping just a few feet away. He opened the heavy leather binder and pulled out a stack of crisp white federal documents bearing the bright red seals of the United States District Court. "Dominic," Oliver said, his voice slicing through the tense silence, "we have notified the FBI regarding the $500,000 corporate bridge loan you fraudulently secured 3 hours ago. The forged signature has been verified. The funds are frozen, and the federal wire fraud charges have been formally submitted." Dominic staggered back as if he had been physically struck. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The wealthy guests gasped, a collective wave of horror washing over the room. The illusion of the high society art auction was instantly shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality of a federal crime scene. "Furthermore," Oliver continued, turning his icy gaze toward Megan, "the temporary medical guardianship order you obtained via an illegal bribe to a currently incarcerated psychiatrist has been completely nullified by a federal judge. My client is in full possession of his mental faculties, and he has executed his legal right as the primary lien holder of this property." Megan's jaw dropped. She looked at Dominic, panic finally piercing her rage. "I did not speak to them. I did not offer explanations or demand apologies. I simply raised my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my faded flannel shirt, and checked my heavy steel watch." The second hand ticked steadily, methodically. It was exactly 8 o'clock. The low, distant rumble began as a subtle vibration beneath the Italian marble floors. It quickly swelled into a deep, guttural roar that rattled the massive bay windows. A deafening, prolonged blast from a heavy industrial air horn shattered the remaining silence of the grand foyer. The guests turned in unison toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured front lawn. The darkness outside was suddenly illuminated by the blinding glare of massive high-intensity halogen floodlights piercing through the wrought iron gates. The grinding metallic screech of heavy diesel engines roared to life, drowning out the frantic murmurs of the terrified socialites. 3 massive industrial-grade bulldozers had arrived. The sheer panic in this room was palpable and immediate. The wealthy attendees abandoned their curated elegance in an instant. Crystal champagne flutes slipped from trembling fingers and shattered against the imported marble floors, adding a sharp percussion on to the deafening mechanical roar vibrating outside. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women in haute couture dresses shoved past each other, rushing toward the massive bay windows to witness the source of the mechanical thunder. I stood my ground in the center of the room, watching the chaotic scramble with absolute emotional detachment. Through the towering panes of glass, the brutal reality of my execution order was fully illuminated. The custom-wrought iron gates that Dominic had commissioned to symbolize his untouchable status offered absolutely zero resistance. The lead bulldozer, an enormous machine of solid yellow steel, simply drove right through them. The metal gates buckled and shrieked under the immense hydraulic pressure, snapping off their stone hinges and crashing violently onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The 2 trailing bulldozers followed in tight formation, their heavy steel tracks biting deep into the manicured front lawn. Decades of expensive landscaping, custom topiary, and imported rose bushes were instantly chewed up and churned into wet, muddy ruin. The massive diesel engines revved, sending thick plumes of black exhaust into the cool night air. The machines did not stop at the edge of the property. They advanced with relentless, terrifying purpose, forming a tight semicircle around the perimeter of the mansion. The bright halogen floodlights mounted on the cabs of the bulldozers swept across the glass, casting long, erratic shadows over the terrified faces of the high society guests pressing against the windows. But the heavy machinery was not the only force invading the estate. 6 armored black SUVs swerved through the ruined gateway, their red and blue emergency lights cutting through the darkness. The vehicles came to a sharp, tactical halt, forming a solid blockade behind the heavy equipment. More than a dozen United States Marshals stepped out into the floodlit yard. They wore dark tactical gear, with heavy utility belts, their windbreakers emblazoned with bold yellow lettering. They moved with swift military precision, fanning out across the ruined lawn to secure the entire perimeter of the property. They were not local police responding to a noise complaint. They were a federal strike team deployed to secure a condemned asset and oversee a high-priority criminal arrest. The guests inside the foyer watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the federal agents took their positions. The illusion of safety, the belief that money and status could repel any consequence, evaporated in the span of 60 seconds. The mansion was no longer a palace of luxury. It was a surrounded federal crime scene and a condemned structure waiting for the final devastating blow. I watched the flashing lights reflect off the terrified faces of the elite crowd, knowing that the empire my son thought he stole had just been turned into a federal trap. Dominic stood entirely frozen, his eyes wide and fixed on the flashing emergency lights outside. His jaw trembled, but he could not articulate a single word. He was watching the physical manifestation of his utter ruin bearing down on him with thousands of pounds of hydraulic force. Oliver Thorne did not give my son a moment to process the sheer scale of the disaster. The attorney stepped forward, closing the physical distance between them. Oliver reached into his heavy leather binder and extracted a thick, stapled packet of legal documents bearing the unmistakable watermark of the county clerk and the federal district court. He thrust the paperwork directly into Dominic's chest, forcing my son to take it with shaking hands. Dominic stared at the front page, his eyes darting wildly across the bold black text. It was the absolute, undeniable end of the line. Oliver turned his back on Dominic and faced the crowded room, projecting his voice with the booming, commanding authority of a seasoned litigator dominating a courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Oliver announced, his voice cutting effortlessly through the ambient panic of the foyer. "I strongly advise you to listen very carefully to what I am about to say for your own legal protection. The land beneath this physical structure has been legally sold to a commercial developer by the true title holder standing right here. The property you are currently standing inside has been officially condemned, and a federal demolition order is being executed tonight. The heavy machinery outside is not a mistake. They are here to level this entire estate down to the foundation." The wealthy guests gasped, stepping back from the windows as if the glass itself had become radioactive. But Oliver was not finished. He raised his hand, demanding absolute silence. Furthermore, he continued, his tone hardening into a lethal blade. "The art auction you were invited to attend this evening is a complete fabrication. The paintings hanging on these walls are entirely worthless counterfeits procured from an underground supplier. This entire gala was explicitly orchestrated to launder your personal checks directly into an offshore bank account. You are currently standing in the middle of a massive federal wire fraud scheme, and the hosts of this event are about to be indicted for a litany of felony charges, including elder exploitation, bank fraud, and grand larceny." The revelation struck the room like a physical shockwave. The elegant, sophisticated facade of the evening was completely annihilated. The politicians, the real estate moguls, and the technology investors stared at the fake art on the walls, and then turned their collective gaze toward Dominic and Megan. The realization of what had just occurred settled heavily over the crowd. They had not just been invited to a gala. They had been actively recruited as unwitting accomplices in a multi-million-dollar federal crime. Dominic tried to open his mouth to offer a defense, but his voice failed him completely. He was a fraud stripped bare in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The silence in the foyer lasted for only a fraction of a second before the room erupted into sheer, unadulterated chaos. The instinct for self-preservation overrode every rule of high society etiquette. The elite guests realized instantly that handing personal checks to a man currently surrounded by United States Marshals and facing federal wire fraud charges would expose them to devastating criminal investigations. Their reputations, their businesses, and their own freedom were suddenly on the line. The panic was instantaneous and violent. The prominent real estate mogul who had handed Dominic a massive check just 15 minutes earlier shoved his way through the dense crowd. His face was flushed with explosive rage. He grabbed Dominic by the lapels of his midnight blue tuxedo, violently shaking him. "Give me my check back right now, you fraudulent piece of garbage!" the mogul roared, spit flying from his lips. The sudden physical aggression broke the dam. Dozens of wealthy investors and socialites surged forward, abandoning their spouses and dropping their expensive coats to swarm the center of the foyer. They surrounded Dominic and Megan, forming a suffocating, angry mob. They screamed demands for their money, hurling vicious insults and threatening immediate civil lawsuits. Men in tailored suits pushed against each other desperately, trying to reach Dominic's breast pocket, where the thick stack of laundered checks rested. Megan tried to back away, her emerald green designer dress catching on the sharp edge of a marble table, but she was completely boxed in. The women she had just been sipping champagne with now glared at her with pure venom, blocking every possible escape route. She held her hands up defensively, pleading with the angry crowd, but her words were completely drowned out by the shouting. The trap had closed with absolute crushing finality. They had built an empire on lies, attempting to finance their escape on the backs of their arrogant friends, and now they were being torn apart by the very people they tried to exploit. I watched the scene unfold with a cold, grim satisfaction. My son and his wife were drowning in a sea of their own making, and there was absolutely no one left to throw them a lifeline. The angry mob of socialites was at a fever pitch, clawing at Dominic's tuxedo jacket, when the heavy front doors were violently thrown fully open. The federal strike team did not knock a second time. More than a dozen United States Marshals poured into the grand foyer, their heavy tactical boots striking the Italian marble with deafening synchronized authority. They moved with aggressive, undeniable purpose, cutting straight through the panicked crowd of wealthy investors. The elite guests, previously enraged and shouting, immediately scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the walls to clear a wide path for the armed federal agents. The lead marshal, a tall, imposing man with a hardened expression, marched directly toward the center of the room where Dominic and Megan stood frozen in absolute terror. He did not offer a polite greeting. He grabbed Dominic by the shoulder, spinning him around with forceful precision, and kicked his legs apart. Dominic let out a pathetic gasp as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the cavernous foyer, sounding like a death knell for his stolen empire. A second agent moved simultaneously toward Megan. She tried to step backward, her emerald green designer dress catching on the edge of a crystal display table, but the agent grabbed her wrists firmly. She shrieked a piercing sound of utter disbelief as the cold steel bracelets locked tightly over her skin. The lead marshal stood tall, his voice booming over the terrified whispers of the crowd, officially placing them under federal arrest. He recited their Miranda rights with practiced mechanical coldness, ensuring every single guest heard the devastating charges. Dominic and Megan were being detained for multiple counts of federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit medical malpractice, severe elder exploitation, and grand larceny. The marshal explicitly mentioned the forged commercial bridge loan and the fraudulent medical guardianship orders. As the rights were read, the remaining shreds of Dominic's arrogance evaporated completely. He was physically trembling, his knees buckling under the crushing weight of his newly cemented reality. An agent reached into Dominic's breast pocket and extracted the thick stack of freshly written checks, securing them in a clear plastic evidence bag. The massive payout they had so desperately counted on was now nothing more than a cataloged exhibit in a federal prosecution. I stood completely still, watching my son and his wife stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and their power, right in the middle of the extravagant gala they had designed to fund their escape. The federal agents patted them down, treating the impeccably dressed couple with the exact same rough, uncompromising procedure reserved for common street criminals. The psychological pressure cooker of the federal arrest instantly pulverized the fragile, desperate alliance between my son and his wife. The moment the steel cuffs locked around their wrists, their united front completely shattered. Megan twisted violently in the grip of the federal agent, her perfectly styled hair falling in erratic strands across her face. She turned her vicious, panicked gaze toward Dominic, her voice pitching into a hysterical scream. She shouted to the arresting officers that she had absolutely nothing to do with the corporate bridge loan. She screamed that the forgery was entirely Dominic's idea, that he had manipulated the commercial banks behind her back, and that she was merely a victim of his reckless financial incompetence. She loudly offered to testify against him, begging the federal agents for total immunity right there in the middle of the foyer. Dominic's head snapped up, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The betrayal from his own wife was the final agonizing blow. He strained against the grip of the marshal holding him, spitting his own venomous accusations right back at her. He roared that Megan was a treacherous parasite who had secretly hired a black market broker to sell the mansion out from under him. He shouted to the federal agents that she was the exact person who orchestrated the fake medical diagnosis, paid the corrupt psychiatrist, and masterminded the counterfeit art auction to launder money into an offshore account. They stood in the center of their ruined gala, screaming vicious, damning confessions at each other, actively destroying whatever microscopic chance of a legal defense they might have had. Their mutual destruction was absolute. The lead marshal had heard enough. He signaled to his team, cutting off the explosive argument. The agents forcefully marched Dominic and Megan out of the grand foyer, parading them past the horrified stares of the local politicians and real estate moguls they had tried to swindle. I watched them being dragged out through the shattered front doors, stumbling over the broken wrought iron gates in their expensive shoes. They were shoved into the back of two completely separate armored police cruisers. The heavy doors slammed shut physically, isolating them in their catastrophic failure. They had betrayed everyone who ever trusted them, and in the end, they had brutally betrayed each other. The departure of the federal agents shattered the paralysis gripping the remaining guests. The sheer reality of the impending demolition finally registered among the elite crowd. Absolute panic erupted once again as the socialites sprinted toward the exits, abandoning their expensive coats and leaving a trail of broken glass in their wake. They poured out of the mansion frantically, waving down their valet drivers and scrambling into their luxury vehicles. A chaotic exodus of imported sports cars and black sedans clogged the suburban street, fleeing the federal crime scene as fast as their engines would carry them. Within 10 minutes, the sprawling estate was entirely abandoned, leaving the ruined mansion completely empty. I stepped out onto the front porch, the cool night air wrapping around my shoulders. Oliver Thorne stood quietly beside me, signaling the demolition crew foreman to proceed. The lead bulldozer roared, thick black smoke billowing from its exhaust stack as the operator engaged the heavy steel tracks. The massive machine lurched forward, driving mercilessly over the meticulously manicured rose bushes and the custom fountain Dominic had installed to showcase his wealth. The heavy steel blade raised high, catching the glare of the halogen floodlights. With a terrifying grinding crash, the bulldozer drove directly into the front facade of the mansion. The blade took a massive destructive bite out of the grand marble columns supporting the entryway. The structural integrity of the facade failed instantly. The roofline sagged and heavy chunks of imported stone and drywall crashed down onto the pristine driveway, sending thick clouds of white dust billowing into the dark sky. The second and third bulldozers moved in systematically, tearing into the wings of the house, reducing the monument of their unearned arrogance to twisted metal and splintered wood. I stood there in my scuffed boots and faded flannel shirt, watching the destruction of my son's stolen kingdom. I felt no sorrow. I felt no regret. I watched the walls collapse and the chandeliers shatter with absolute cold indifference. The disease had been entirely eradicated, and the ground was finally ready to be cleared. The harsh morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light across the suburban street. I stood alone on the pristine concrete sidewalk, with my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my heavy denim jacket. The crisp air was thick with the scent of pulverized drywall and churned earth. Where a sprawling multi-million-dollar monument to unearned arrogance had stood just 12 hours prior, there was now absolutely nothing. The massive 3-story mansion, with its imported Italian marble custom crystal chandeliers and towering oak doors, had been completely eradicated. The heavy demolition crew had worked relentlessly through the night, executing their contract with brutal mechanical efficiency. 3 industrial bulldozers and a fleet of massive dump trucks had hauled away the wreckage, leaving behind a vast flat expanse of raw, overturned dirt. The physical manifestation of Dominic's insatiable greed had been entirely wiped from the face of the earth. There was no grand foyer for Megan to host her fraudulent galas. There was no corner office for Dominic to scheme and plot his illegal takeovers. The land was stripped bare and scraped clean down to the bedrock. A heavy commercial chain-link fence now surrounded the perimeter, bearing the bright orange development signs of the commercial retail firm that had purchased the plot. I walked slowly along the edge of the property boundary, pressing my scuffed work boot against the cold metal fencing. The neighborhood around the lot was eerily quiet. The wealthy neighbors who had attended the disastrous art auction were likely hiding inside their own mansions, frantically calling their lawyers and desperately trying to distance themselves from the massive federal wire fraud scandal that had erupted on their street. They had witnessed the absolute destruction of a man who tried to steal an empire, and that brutal lesson would echo through this gated community for decades. I looked at the empty dirt lot one last time. I felt no lingering attachment to the space and absolutely no regret for the aggressive actions I took to reclaim it. The cancerous rot that had infected my family had been surgically, aggressively removed. The slate was completely wiped clean. I turned away from the empty lot and walked back to where my heavily rusted vintage blue pickup truck was parked along the curb. The engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble that vibrated through the worn floorboards. I shifted the heavy transmission into gear and drove out of the affluent gated subdivision for the absolute last time. I steered the truck away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the corporate downtown and headed toward the quiet rolling hills on the eastern edge of the county. The drive was peaceful, the rhythmic hum of the highway tires providing a steady, grounding soundtrack to my racing thoughts. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the municipal cemetery, navigating the narrow, winding asphalt paths until I reached a quiet, shaded grove situated beneath a massive, ancient oak tree. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the crisp morning air, holding a single flawless white rose I had purchased from a small roadside florist. I walked deliberately over the damp, manicured grass until I stood before a simple, elegant granite headstone bearing the name of my late wife, Sylvia. I knelt down, slowly resting my calloused hand against the cold, polished stone. I placed the pristine white rose gently at the base of the marker. I stayed there in the profound, respectful silence of the cemetery, bowing my head and speaking to her not with grief, but with quiet, fierce pride. I told her the entire truth about the last few agonizing days. I explained how our son had allowed toxic entitlement to completely corrupt his soul. I detailed the forged medical documents, the attempted commercial bank fraud, and the ruthless, desperate betrayal he orchestrated with his wife. But then I told her about the holding company. I told her how the impenetrable legal fortress we designed together decades ago under the flickering light of our tiny kitchen had performed flawlessly. It had successfully repelled a multi-million-dollar corporate hijack from our own flesh and blood. I spoke her name into the morning wind, assuring her that the massive logistics empire we built with blistered hands and relentless sacrifice was entirely safe. The legacy she helped forge, rooted in honest labor and unshakable integrity, remained completely untainted by their deceit. I promised her that the wealth would be utilized responsibly, restructured to support charitable foundations and honest, hard-working employees who actually earned their keep. The criminal element had been excised, and her honor was permanently secured. I stood up, brushing the damp grass from the knees of my jeans. A profound, overwhelming sense of closure washed over my chest. I had fulfilled my silent vow to protect what was ours. By mid-morning, I navigated my truck back into the modest working-class neighborhood where Sylvia and I had purchased our very first home. It was a small single-story ranch house with faded siding, a slightly overgrown front lawn, and a wide wrap-around wooden porch that creaked familiarly under heavy footsteps. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the opulent, towering mansions Dominic had desperately craved, but to me it was the only place that had ever felt like a true sanctuary. I parked the truck in the cracked concrete driveway and walked up the sturdy wooden steps. Inside, the house was utterly silent, smelling faintly of old books and pine polish. I walked straight into the narrow kitchen, grabbed my favorite chipped ceramic mug, and brewed a strong, dark pot of black coffee. I did not check my phone for frantic, threatening text messages. I did not review commercial legal briefs or monitor global logistics tracking software. Those burdens were entirely dissolved. I carried the steaming mug back outside and eased my tired frame into the weathered oak rocking chair, positioned perfectly on the front porch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scorching black coffee, letting the rich, bitter flavor ground me entirely in the present moment. I watched a gentle morning breeze rustle the leaves of the large elm tree in the front yard. A profound, absolute stillness settled over my mind. The federal authorities were currently processing Dominic and Megan, stripping away their tailored suits and locking them into cold concrete holding cells where they would spend the next decade contemplating their massive failures. The commercial operating shell had been completely dissolved, and my true wealth remained safely locked away, untouchable and secure. I leaned back against the hard wooden slats of the chair, resting my boots against the porch railing. I felt the morning sun hit my face, warming my weathered skin. I was no longer a target. I was no longer an obstacle waiting to be removed by greedy predators. I was just a man enjoying his coffee on a quiet suburban street. I was completely unburdened, entirely secure, and for the first time in 40 years, I was finally unequivocally free. The dust has settled on the empty lot, where a monument to greed once stood. The federal authorities have processed the architects of the betrayal. The commercial fleet has resumed its routes under proper management. The legal battles are over. Yet beyond the immediate tactical victories and the dramatic public reckoning, there remains a profound psychological and philosophical lesson embedded deep within this entire ordeal. This is a lesson that extends far beyond corporate sabotage or familial betrayal. It is a stark, unyielding examination of the human condition, specifically regarding how proximity to wealth often breeds a catastrophic disconnect from reality. The ultimate lesson learned from this extensive ordeal is the fatal danger of confusing access with ownership. It is the realization that unearned entitlement is not merely a character flaw, but a destructive force that inevitably annihilates the person who wields it. Dominic and Megan did not fail simply because they executed a sloppy legal strategy. They failed because their entire worldview was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes true power, true wealth, and true respect. They believed that by occupying the corner office and sleeping in the master bedroom of a sprawling mansion, they had inherently acquired the strength and intellect required to sustain that level of existence. They conflated the shiny veneer of success with the grueling structural foundation required to uphold it. The anatomy of the silver spoon syndrome. To understand the magnitude of their failure, one must analyze the psychology of the inheritor versus the psychology of the builder. When an individual builds an empire from the dirt up, they understand the granular value of every single brick. They remember the blistering cold of the freight yards. They remember the terrifying uncertainty of securing the first commercial loan. They remember the agonizing sacrifices required to keep the engine running when the rest of the world is fast asleep. That grueling process builds a profound respect for the fragility of success. The builder knows that ruin is always just one catastrophic misstep away. The entitled inheritor, however, arrives at the finish line completely bypassing the marathon. Dominic stepped into a pristine operating company that was already generating massive revenue. He was handed a polished machine. He never had to worry about payroll bouncing. He never had to personally guarantee a high-risk equipment loan with his own private home. Because he was insulated from the brutal realities of wealth creation, he developed a dangerous, arrogant complacency. He looked at the massive logistical network, and instead of feeling a deep sense of custodial responsibility, he felt an overwhelming sense of supreme ownership. He convinced himself that the company was successful purely because he was sitting in the executive chair. This is the exact point where ambition metastasizes into greed. When an individual believes they are inherently deserving of luxury, without having paid the toll of labor. They begin to view the actual creators of that wealth with deep-seated resentment. Dominic did not look at me with gratitude for providing him a life of extreme comfort. He looked at me with venomous impatience. He viewed my continued existence and my retention oft of the primary holding company as an unjust delay to his rightful coronation. He convinced himself that I was an outdated, obsolete relic standing in the way of his absolute supremacy. The predator's miscalculation. Meghan amplified this toxic entitlement exponentially. If Dominic was the arrogant inheritor, Meghan was the calculating parasite. She operated on the assumption that wealth was a game of appearances rather than a structure of hard assets. She measured a person's worth entirely by the designer labels they wore and the exclusive zip codes they inhabited. Because I chose to wear faded flannel shirts and live in a modest suburban home, she fundamentally underestimated my intellectual capacity and my operational ruthlessness. She confused humility with weakness. She assumed that an older man who preferred the quiet simplicity of a porch and a cup of black coffee would be entirely incapable of defending himself against a sophisticated multi-million-dollar extortion plot. This is a critical warning for anyone observing this dynamic. Predators like Meghan rely heavily on societal stereotypes regarding aging. They weaponize the natural progression of time. They use the concept of cognitive decline not as a genuine medical concern, but as a convenient weaponized narrative to sideline the elderly. They assume that advanced age automatically equates to diminished awareness. They believe that because a person has exited the active daily grind of the corporate battlefield, they have somehow lost their tactical edge. What they fail to comprehend is that the wisdom forged in the fires of decades of hardship does not evaporate simply because the hair turns gray. The strategic mind that built a corporate empire from absolute nothingness does not suddenly forget how to play the game. In fact, that mind becomes infinitely more dangerous because it operates without the reckless, impulsive ego of youth. It operates with the cold, clinical patience of an apex predator waiting in the tall grass. The necessity of the ironclad legal boundary. The practical application of this lesson lies in the concept of the defensive perimeter. Trust within a family is a beautiful concept, but it is an absolutely terrible business strategy. The existence of the holding company was not born out of a desire to deceive my son. It was born out of a deep, profound understanding of human frailty. Sylvia and I knew that massive wealth has a gravitational pull that corrupts even the strongest moral compasses. We understood that setting up an invisible legal fortress was the ultimate act of preservation. Many individuals who achieve significant success make the fatal error of blindly trusting their bloodline with their assets. They hand over the keys to the kingdom under the naive assumption that familial bonds will override financial greed. They co-sign massive loans for their children. They add their relatives to the primary deeds of their homes. They hand over medical and financial powers of attorney without establishing any independent oversight or fail-safes. They essentially arm the very people who might one day decide to turn those weapons against them. The lesson here is absolute, uncompromising compartmentalization. You must separate your emotional love for your family from the cold, hard administration of your legacy. Building a legal wall does not mean you do not love your children. It means you respect the corruptive nature of money enough to protect your children from their own worst impulses. By retaining the irrevocable deeds to the land and burying the commercial fleet inside a phantom legal structure, I ensured that Dominic's greed could only destroy his own illusion, not the actual empire. I gave him enough rope to hang himself, but I completely denied him the leverage required to pull down the entire family tree. The illusion of the quick exit. Another facet of this lesson is the total fallacy of the frictionless escape. Both Dominic and Meghan believed they could execute a massive, sophisticated crime without suffering the gravitational consequences. They thought they could forge federal banking documents, bribe licensed medical professionals, launder money through fake art auctions, and simply board a private jet into the sunset. They operated under the delusion that their status, their zip code, and their expensive wardrobes provided an invisible shield against the brutal machinery of the justice system. This highlights the extreme danger of living in an echo chamber of wealth. When individuals are surrounded only by sycophants and paid employees who never challenge their authority, they lose the ability to accurately assess risk. Dominic clicked a button to submit a forged commercial loan application with the casual indifference of a man ordering lunch. He had been insulated from consequence for so long that he genuinely believed the rules of the real world no longer applied to him. He failed to realize that the moment you cross the line into federal wire fraud, the luxury suits and the marble foyers mean absolutely nothing. The federal government does not care about your country club membership. They only care about the paper trail, the true definition of legacy and honor. Ultimately, this story demands a reevaluation of what it means to leave a legacy. A true legacy is not defined by the balance of a bank account or the square footage of a suburban estate. A legacy is the unshakable foundation of values, integrity, and resilience that you leave behind. Sylvia and I built our business not just to accumulate capital, but to prove that honest, grueling labor yields a sustainable life. We wanted to create something solid, something real. Dominic attempted to inherit the capital while entirely discarding the integrity. He wanted the crown without carrying the cross. By stepping out of the shadows and violently dismantling his fraudulent existence, I did not destroy our family legacy. I protected it. I ensured that the name we built through decades of sweat and sacrifice would not be permanently associated with cowardice, extortion, and elder abuse. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can perform for a legacy is to completely burn down the corrupted branches of the family tree to save the roots. The destruction of the mansion was the physical manifestation of this philosophy. Leaving the house standing would have been a concession. It would have allowed the monument of their treachery to remain a permanent fixture on the landscape. Leveling the structure to the dirt was a necessary purge. It sent an undeniable message to anyone observing the fallout. Greed, built on deception, will eventually be crushed under the weight of its own arrogance. You cannot steal the foundation of a house and expect the roof to hold. A call for vigilance and self-respect. The final component of this lesson is a demand for absolute, unwavering self-respect among the older generation. Society conditions the elderly to become passive. It expects them to quietly fade into the background, handing over their autonomy and their assets to the younger generation without raising a fuss. It conditions them to accept disrespect, negligence, and outright abuse under the guise of maintaining family harmony. You must violently reject this conditioning. Your age does not diminish your value. The years you have lived, the battles you have fought, and the resources you have accumulated demand absolute respect. Do not allow your children, your in-laws, or anyone else to treat you as a disposable resource. Do not permit them to speak to you with condescension. Do not let them manipulate your love into a financial blank check. You must remain vigilant. You must monitor your accounts, secure your properties, and guard your independence with ruthless aggression. If you detect the creeping rot of entitlement within your family, you must address it immediately. Do not wait for the ambush. Do not wait for the forged documents or the fake medical evaluations. Establish your boundaries with ironclad legal frameworks and enforce them without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt. You have earned the right to live your final chapters in absolute peace and total security. Anyone who attempts to compromise that peace, whether they share your blood or not, must be treated as a hostile threat and dealt with accordingly. This is not a tragedy of a family torn apart. This is a triumph of a man refusing to be a victim. It is the story of a silent, quiet architect who watched the thieves enter his house and patiently waited until they locked themselves inside the vault before throwing away the key. True power does not scream. True power does not boast. True power sits quietly in the shadows, holding the execution orders, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. If you have ever felt the sharp sting of being underestimated by the very people you helped elevate or if you have ever had to draw a hard, unyielding line to protect your own dignity and resources, it is time to make your voice heard. We must build a community that refuses to accept the role of the silent victim. Share your own experiences of setting boundaries and reclaiming your power in the comments section below. Let your story serve as a warning to the entitled and a beacon of hope for those currently fighting to protect their legacy. Hit the like button if you agree that respect must be earned through integrity rather than demanded through proximity. Subscribe to the channel to join a growing movement of individuals who understand that true strength lies in preparation, patience, and the absolute refusal to compromise your hard-earned peace. Your legacy is yours to protect. Stand firm, stay vigilant, and never let anyone convince you that your time for fighting is over.